The security guard looked at me, then glanced back at the photo on his computer and shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You are not Mr. Harrison's wife." I smiled, thinking it was a terrible joke. 40 years of marriage, 2 children, an entire life standing behind my husband's career. And with a single sentence, I suddenly became a stranger. Before I could react, the elevator doors opened. A woman nearly 20 years younger than me stepped out, her high heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison." Every employee lowered their head to greet her, and me, the real wife, stood there, frozen. But in that very moment, I made a silent decision. I would not leave. I would stay. And I would find out the truth, no matter the cost. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Margaret Lewis Harrison. I am 60 years old, a retired high school teacher in the state of Illinois. And until that morning, I firmly believed that I was the only woman who carried the Harrison name in my husband's life. 40 years. That number is not just time. It is an entire lifetime. Mornings when I woke up early to make coffee and prepare breakfast so Richard could drive to work on time. Evenings when I waited for him to come home late, reheated dinner, and told myself that men in leadership roles are just like that. The times I turned down career advancement to transfer schools for our children. The years I stood quietly behind him, believing that family was a shared achievement. Richard Harrison is my husband, the chief financial officer of a major real estate corporation in Chicago. He started as a young accountant and climbed step by step to a position everyone now respects. I still remember the day Richard received his first major promotion. I was standing in our small kitchen at the time, my hands trembling with happiness, thinking that all my sacrifices had finally meant something. In recent years, our marriage had lost its warmth. No more spontaneous hand-holding. No more long conversations on the couch on Friday nights. Richard came home later more often, seemed tired, sat silently in front of the television without really watching anything. I didn't suspect anything. I simply thought it was the natural result of age and responsibility. That was why, that morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a very long time. Surprise my husband. I found a small invitation card in the pocket of Richard's suit jacket, printed with the company logo. A 35-year work anniversary at the firm, an internal meeting, no big celebration, no family invited. I smiled as I read it, thinking that maybe a small gesture was enough to remind him that behind all his success, there was still me. I chose a light blue floral dress that Richard once said made me look younger than my age. I tied my hair neatly and applied a soft shade of lipstick, something I rarely did after retirement. Before leaving the house, I looked at myself in the mirror and told myself that today was a good day, a normal, simple day of a wife visiting her husband. The building where Richard worked stood in downtown Chicago, its tall glass facade reflecting the pale gray sky of an autumn morning. I had been there a few times for year-end parties, but it had been a long time since I last returned. Everything looked more modern, colder than I remembered. As soon as I stepped into the lobby, I felt the security guard's gaze. He looked me up and down, not rudely, but with hesitation and scrutiny. I walked up to the reception desk and smiled as I had done for decades. "I'm here to see my husband, Richard Harrison," I said. "I'm Margaret Harrison." The receptionist looked up and typed a few lines on her computer. The smile on her face faltered, then turned into something hard to define. She glanced at the security guard. They exchanged a look so quick that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying attention. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked. That question made me pause. I had come here many times before. I had never needed an appointment to see my husband. "I'm his wife," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I just want to go up and say hello for a moment." The security guard stepped closer. He asked for my identification. I began to feel uneasy, but I still pulled out my wallet and handed him my driver's license. I saw his eyes scan my name, then narrow slightly. That was when he said the sentence that tore my life apart. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You are not Mr. Harrison's wife." In that moment, I truly thought I had misheard him. I smiled. An automatic smile. The reflex of someone who had learned to maintain dignity. I was about to say that he must be mistaken, that my husband and I had been married for over 40 years. But before I could open my mouth, the elevator behind me opened. That woman stepped out, younger than me, in her early 40s. Brown hair neatly styled, a well-fitted office dress. The confident posture of someone completely at home in this space. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at the receptionist and the security guard. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison." The way they said that name, Harrison, was so light, so natural, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She nodded in response and walked on unhurriedly. No one asked for her identification. No one stopped her. In that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood still. It felt as if all the sound around me had disappeared, leaving only the steady click of her high heels against the marble floor, each step striking directly into my chest. I understood one thing very clearly. This was not a secret affair, not a momentary mistake. That woman had a position. She had recognition, at least in this building. My mind began replaying fragments of memory, late meetings, sudden business trips, the way Richard avoided my eyes when I asked if he was tired. Saturday nights when he said he had paperwork to finish. I had thought it was just work. Now each small detail lined up into a cold, undeniable truth. I could have turned away. I could have left that building in humiliation, but I didn't. Maybe it was my age. Maybe 40 years of sacrifice wouldn't allow me to run away like a defeated person. Or maybe there was a part of me, very deep and very stubborn, that needed to know the truth all the way through. I turned back to the reception desk. My voice was strangely calm. "Excuse me," I said. "I have a short interview with Human Resources. I arrived a little early." The receptionist looked at me, hesitating for a few seconds. Maybe I didn't look like a troublemaker. Maybe my age made them careless. She nodded and pointed toward the elevator on the right. "8th floor," she said. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, reflecting my face in the dull metal surface. A 60-year-old woman, hair streaked with gray, eyes no longer as gentle as before. I pressed the button, feeling my heart pound so hard it seemed anyone standing beside me could hear it. As the elevator began to rise, I understood that I had willingly stepped into my own nightmare. But I also knew that from this moment on, I would no longer be the woman who closed her eyes and trusted blindly. I would be the one who asked questions, who observed, who faced the truth, no matter how cruel it might be. The elevator doors closed behind me, lifting me upward while my mind drifted far back to the years I once believed were the most solid, the safest, and also the years in which I had never once seriously asked myself, was I being betrayed? 40 years ago, Richard and I met when we were both very young. I was a college student studying education, carrying simple dreams, to become a good teacher, to have a small family, a warm home, and a life rich in meaning. Richard was different. He was ambitious, driven, always looking ahead, but it was that very difference that drew us together. I believed love could fill any gap. We married when I was 23. The wedding was small, not lavish. A simple ceremony in a local church, with family and close friends present. I still clearly remember the moment Richard held my hand and whispered that he would take care of me for the rest of his life. I believed him completely, without a single doubt. At that age, I thought that as long as two people tried together, nothing was impossible. The early years of marriage were not easy. Richard started his career at a very low position. The pay was modest, the pressure high. I taught full-time, managing the household and saving every dollar. There were evenings when we sat at a small dining table, eating simple meals, talking about the future as if it were guaranteed. All we needed was a little more patience. When our children were born, life became even busier. I once had the opportunity to take a senior academic position at my school, a step many colleagues dreamed of, but it would have meant staying later, attending weekend training programs, and traveling often. Richard was at a crucial stage of his career. After many sleepless nights, I turned down the opportunity. I told myself the family needed me more, that there would be time for myself later. One refusal, then another. Gradually, I became used to stepping back, not because I was forced, but because I believed it was the right choice. Richard needed a stable support system. The children needed a mother who was always present, and I was proud that I could be that person. Richard advanced year by year. Every time he was promoted, I was the first to hear the news. I was the one standing in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine, cooking better than usual meals to celebrate. I remember the light in his eyes, the way he held me and said he couldn't have done it without me. Those words became my emotional anchor, convincing me that every sacrifice had value. Over time, a distance began to form between us. Very slowly, very quietly, so quietly that I didn't notice at first. Richard worked more. Meetings ran longer. Business trips became more frequent. At first, he still told me about his work, his colleagues, the pressures of his new role. I listened and encouraged him, as I always had. But those stories gradually became fewer. Richard came home later, ate dinner in silence, sometimes only nodded instead of answering. I asked if he was tired. He said he was fine. I asked if he needed rest. He said the work wasn't finished. I became used to not asking more. In recent years, Richard's changes became more obvious. He often came home very late. Some nights I was already asleep when he returned, and in the morning he left before I woke up. We lived under the same roof, but the time we truly spent together grew smaller and smaller. I saw his fatigue, his fading smile, the sense that he was always somewhere far away, even when sitting across from me. I once wondered whether we were slowly becoming strangers, but the thought never lasted long. I pushed it aside, convincing myself that this was normal for couples who had been together for decades. That passion couldn't last forever. That mature love was quieter and more enduring. I told myself Richard worked hard for the family, for the children, for the future. I believed his exhaustion was the price of success, and I accepted that price, as I had accepted so many things throughout this marriage. We no longer had big arguments, no more fights. Everything was smooth to the point where I once thought it was a good sign. No conflict, no drama, a stable, peaceful marriage. I called it safe. I never doubted Richard's loyalty. Not because I was naive, but because I believed some men, no matter how many temptations they face, still keep boundaries. Richard was always principled. He wasn't the type who enjoyed parties, who showed off, who flirted. At least that was how I saw him. I never checked his phone, never tracked his schedule. I respected my husband's privacy and believed that respect was the foundation of a lasting relationship. I believed that if he had something to say, he would tell me. That absolute trust became the perfect blindfold. It made me overlook the smallest signs. When Richard changed his computer password, I thought it was a company security requirement. When he took his phone into the bathroom, I thought it was a harmless habit. When he replied to late-night messages evasively, I thought it was work. I built a world for myself where everything had a reasonable explanation, where there was no place for betrayal. I believed that after 40 years, if something were wrong, I would feel it. I trusted my intuition, not knowing that intuition can be numbed by habit and long-standing trust. Standing in the rising elevator, I suddenly realized that the most painful thing was not seeing another woman called Mrs. Harrison. The most painful thing was realizing that for many years I had lived in a false sense of safety, that I had placed my entire trust in a marriage whose foundation I had never once examined. I don't blame myself for believing. Belief itself is not wrong. But I began to understand that it was precisely that unconditional trust that made today's shock so brutally cruel. If I had ever doubted, perhaps I would have been mentally prepared. If I had ever asked questions, perhaps I would not have stood frozen in that lobby. The elevator slowed. A soft chime sounded. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. 40 years of marriage that I once believed was solid was now being examined under an entirely different light, and I knew that once these doors opened, I could never return to being the woman who trusted without question. The elevator stopped with a very soft sound, as if it didn't want to startle me. The doors slid open, revealing a space completely different from the lobby below. It was quieter here, the white lighting softer, everything arranged with near-clinical neatness. This was the executive floor, where Richard had spent most of his adult life. I stepped out slowly, forcing my posture to look as natural as possible. No one noticed me right away, and that brought both relief and pain. Relief because I wasn't stopped. Pain because I realized that in this space, my existence seemed to carry no weight. I stood near the main hallway where I could see the private reception area of the executive floor. From there, I observed. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew that I needed to see, to hear, to understand. And then I saw her, Lauren. She wasn't wearing a coat, wasn't carrying a handbag like a visitor. She walked out of a small conference room holding a thin folder, her manner so familiar that no one needed to ask how long she had been there. A middle-aged man stood up to greet her, calling her name, warmly. Another woman smiled and asked if she wanted coffee. No one looked surprised by her presence. No one watched her with suspicion. She was an obvious part of this place. I stood there silently, feeling as though I were watching a play in which the lead role had been given to someone else long ago, while I was just a late-arriving audience member, never told that the story had already taken a different turn. The way they spoke to Lauren wasn't how people spoke to an ordinary colleague. There was closeness, familiarity built over years of working together. There was respect, and there was warmth. One man joked that lunch at the Italian restaurant yesterday had been wonderful. Another woman asked whether Lauren would take the kids out this weekend. The kids. I felt a slight tightening in my chest, just enough to make me take a deep breath. I didn't know whose children they were talking about. I didn't want to guess. But the pieces in my mind began to shift, quietly and terrifyingly. Then I heard that name, clearly, unmistakably. Lauren Bennett Harrison. The woman standing near the reception desk said the name as she transferred a call. Her voice was natural, as if it were a familiar name she had spoken hundreds of times. Harrison. That last name used to be mine, the name I carried for 40 years, through every stage of my life, the name I signed on my children's birth certificates, on property documents, on greeting cards sent to friends. And now it was attached to another woman, younger than me, standing just a few yards away, completely unaware that I existed. My heart tightened, not with ordinary jealousy, but with a deep sense of loss, as if a part of my identity had been taken from me and handed to someone else without my consent. I began to understand something I had been trying to avoid. Richard didn't just betray me in silence. He didn't just have a hidden relationship behind my back. He had built a parallel life, public, stable, long enough for everyone here to treat it as a given, a life in which there was no place for me. I took a few more steps, moving closer to the reception area on this floor. Immediately, a young woman looked up, her expression polite but distant. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Richard Harrison," I said, my voice sounding unfamiliar even to myself. "I'm his wife." The young woman looked at me, then at the screen in front of her, and typed a few lines. I saw hesitation flicker briefly in her eyes. Then she smiled, a perfectly professional smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "Mr. Harrison is in a meeting, and we don't have any appointment information for you. Not, he can't see you, not, please wait, but no record of me." I repeated it more slowly, as if clarity might change something. "I'm his wife." The young woman tilted her head slightly, a trace of confusion crossing her face, then turned to a man standing nearby, probably an assistant. They exchanged a look. I saw them speak quietly, but I didn't need to hear the words. I wasn't in the system. I didn't belong here. The man stepped forward, his tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, at this time we can't allow you into Mr. Harrison's private work area without prior confirmation." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, because in that moment I realized how fragile my position was. If I reacted emotionally, if I caused a scene, I would become an older woman making trouble, an inconvenience to be handled quickly. And I wasn't here to be escorted out. That feeling of rejection was unlike anything I had experienced before. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, cold, like a door closing that you never realized had been open. I felt as if I had been erased from a part of a life I once believed was mine. I looked around again. Everyone continued with their work. Lauren walked past talking to someone, smiling lightly. No one looked at me. No one realized that the woman standing against the wall was Richard Harrison's legal wife. In that moment, a powerful urge rose inside me to step forward, to call Richard's name loudly, to ask them who they thought I was. But I didn't do it. I had lived long enough to know that impulsive reactions rarely bring the truth. They only bring chaos. I chose silence. Silence not because I was weak, but because I needed to observe. I needed to remember every detail, every look, every word. I needed to understand how this picture had been drawn and for how long. In my mind, there was only one thought, so clear it didn't need to be spoken. I needed evidence, not for revenge, not to humiliate anyone, but to protect myself, so that when I faced Richard, and I knew that day was coming very soon, I wouldn't have only emotions, but facts. I stood there a few more minutes, long enough to be certain this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained with a simple apology. Then I turned and walked toward the hallway leading to the conference rooms. My heart beat slower than before, but heavier. Each step carried a new realization. The marriage I once believed was solid had been built on spaces I was never invited into. And I understood that from this moment on, I was no longer a woman living in blind trust. I was someone standing in a place that didn't belong to her, quietly gathering the pieces of a truth that had been hidden for many years. I stood still for a few more seconds, long enough for my heartbeat to slow. No one noticed me. In this place, the silence of an older woman didn't spark curiosity or concern. I realized that was both cruel and my only advantage right now. I continued down the hallway leading into the executive meeting area. When the receptionist on this floor looked up again, I lowered my head slightly and smiled, keeping my voice low and steady. I arrived early for a short discussion with Human Resources, I said, avoiding direct eye contact. They told me I could wait in this area. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Maybe I looked more like a retired teacher than a troublemaker. Maybe no one imagined that a woman my age would have any reason to cause problems on the executive floor. I walked past without being stopped. The hallway was long and quiet, covered in dark gray carpet, evenly lit with no windows. Conference rooms lined both sides, their frosted glass doors revealing long tables, black leather chairs, ceiling-mounted projectors. The faint smell of coffee hung in the air, so familiar it hurt. Richard used to tell me that the smell of coffee at the office helped him stay alert. I had made coffee for him every morning, for decades. I slowed my steps when I heard voices ahead, not Richard's, but voices I guessed had known him for a long time. I stopped at the corner of the hallway, leaning close to the wall, a habit formed during my years as a teacher. Listen before entering an unfamiliar space. "Is Mr. Harrison having lunch with Lauren today?" a man asked casually. "Of course," a female voice replied with a hint of teasing. "Every Thursday. Their usual restaurant." There. The word was soft, but it landed like a weight on my chest. I pressed my back against the wall, my hand unconsciously tightening around my purse strap. I couldn't see them, only hear their voices. Natural, unguarded. "I heard Lauren made the reservation earlier today," the man continued. "Sounds like they want to discuss something important." "Probably the new project," the woman replied. "Lauren always arranges everything so carefully for Mr. Harrison." I closed my eyes for a brief second. Lauren. That name was no longer distant. It echoed here with a familiarity I had never had, not whispered as a secret, not avoided, but part of the daily rhythm of this place. I stood there listening, each sentence like a slow, precise cut. They talked about lunch, about restaurants, about routines, small details that only long-term relationships have. No one lowered their voice. No one sounded cautious. Then the conference room door ahead opened. I didn't have time to step farther back. I stood still, half hidden by the wall. Richard walked out with two other men. He looked exactly as he always did. Dark suit, quick stride, the familiar face I had looked at for 40 years. In that moment, my heart tightened in a completely different way. Not panic, not trembling, but a terrifying stillness. "I have lunch with Lauren today," Richard said calmly, as if confirming a meeting. "We'll continue this later." From his own mouth. No hesitation, no cover-up, no doubt. My world didn't collapse loudly like in the movies. It didn't explode. It froze. Everything around me became sharply clear, the lights, the footsteps, the rustle of papers, and I became empty. A cold sensation spread from my chest to my stomach, then through my limbs. I stopped shaking. I didn't want to cry. I just stood there as if part of me had stepped outside myself to observe everything from a distance. All doubt ended in that moment. No more maybe, no more what if, no more I'm overthinking. The truth stood right in front of me, so clear it didn't need any further proof. Richard didn't just betray me. He had lived another life, openly, in plain sight, among people I had never been introduced to. I watched him turn and walk toward his private office. None of the others noticed me. I was just a faint figure in a long hallway, someone who didn't belong here. And strangely enough, that helped me stay calm. I understood that if I kept standing there, hiding, I would always be an eavesdropper, always an outsider. I had seen enough to know I couldn't go home and pretend I hadn't heard anything, enough to understand that if I didn't confront this now, I might never get another chance. I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep my voice from shaking. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder, smoothed the skirt of my dress, a familiar reflex from years before stepping into a classroom. I was no longer a teacher standing before students, but I was still a woman who had lived long enough to know there are moments you cannot avoid. I stepped out from the shadows and walked straight toward Richard's office door. The door was slightly open. I saw his back as he placed a folder on the desk. His office was spacious, orderly, exactly his style. On the bookshelf were the economics books he used to read in the evenings. On the desk was a framed family photo, taken 10 years earlier before the children married. I had dusted that frame countless times. I knocked. Not loud, not soft, just enough for him to hear. "Come in," Richard said without turning around. I opened the door and stepped inside. The moment he turned and his eyes met mine, I knew I didn't need to say much anymore. Every explanation, every excuse, every denial became meaningless in that instant. His face changed quickly, from surprise to shock, then to panic, a reaction I had seen many times before when students were caught cheating on a test. "Margaret?" he blurted out, his voice rough. What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, looking at the man I had called my husband for 40 years, not to find familiarity, but to confirm that I was seeing him with my own eyes, without the filter of trust. The panic in his eyes was the clearest answer. In that moment, I understood I had crossed a line I could never step back over. I was no longer the woman standing in the hallway listening to fragmented conversations. I had walked straight into the center of the truth, and whatever happened next, I knew that from this point on, I would no longer be passive. I remained standing in front of Richard's desk, not taking another step forward, not out of fear, but because I needed that distance to avoid doing something I might regret. The room was so quiet I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner, even the uneven breathing of the man in front of me. Richard stood up from his chair, then sat back down as if he didn't know what to do with his body. He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture whenever he was unsettled. I had seen it countless times over 40 years, whenever he faced a difficult decision. The difference now was that I was the one trapped without an escape. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I can explain." I nodded slightly, like a teacher allowing a student to begin an answer. I didn't sit down. I didn't lean on anything. I wanted to stay alert. "Go ahead," I said. My voice was so calm it surprised even me. "I'm listening." Richard swallowed hard. He glanced toward the door as if considering whether someone might overhear, then looked back at me. In that moment, I saw how much he had aged, not from years, but from the cracking of the solid shell I had once trusted. I met Lauren 15 years ago. He began slowly. Each word dragged from his chest. During a long business trip in California. At the time, I wasn't looking for anything. It just happened. I didn't react. I didn't ask why. I just looked at him and let him continue. She worked with one of our partner teams, he said. Smart, calm. At first, it was just lunches, work discussions. I knew it was wrong, but I thought I could control it. I listened as if hearing a cold report. No extra details, no emotion. Just a sequence of events arranged to sound reasonable. Then it went beyond control, he continued, his voice dropping. I tried to stop. I really did. My hand tightened around my purse strap. In my mind, I saw the evenings I sat alone in the kitchen, waiting for him to come home late, telling myself his work was always demanding. Lauren got pregnant, Richard said. The sentence fell between us without echo or sound, but I felt a heavy force press down on my chest. I didn't step back. I didn't cover my mouth. I just stood there, receiving it as a final truth that could not be undone. I panicked, he continued. I thought about telling you many times, but every time I looked at you, looked at the kids, I didn't know where to begin. I tilted my head slightly. So you chose not to tell me, I said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded slowly. I thought, if I kept everything stable, if I didn't let it affect the family, then maybe that was the least harmful way. I gave a small laugh, not a happy one, but a very brief, quiet sound, like the reflex of someone who has just heard something too absurd to be real. You thought silence was a way to protect me? I asked. Or a way to protect yourself? Richard lowered his head. Didn't answer right away. His silence said more than any explanation could. You live two lives, I said, each word clear. One with me, one with her. And you call that stability. I'm sorry, Richard said quickly. I never wanted to hurt you. I was afraid of losing you. I looked at him for a long time. Maybe for the first time in years, I wasn't looking at him as a wife, but as someone assessing the truth in front of her. You were afraid of losing me, I repeated. But you weren't afraid of losing honesty. You weren't afraid of losing trust. You weren't afraid of letting me live in a lie for 15 years. Richard reached out his hand, then stopped halfway, as if remembering that he no longer had the right to touch me. I arranged everything, he said. I thought I could manage it. Work, family, responsibilities. I never neglected you or the kids. I took a deep breath. Do you know that every time you said, I'll be home late tonight, it was a lie? I asked. Every time you said you had an unexpected business trip? Every time you walked into the house looking exhausted and silent? Richard didn't respond. I knew he understood. I suddenly realized that for 15 years, I had been living inside a script that was already written, one where I always played the trusting wife, and he played the hard-working family man. Every detail I had accepted without question now stood out clearly, sharply, impossible to deny. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't slam my hand on the desk, maybe because my tears had already run dry the moment I heard Lauren's name spoken in the hallway, or maybe because, in this moment, I no longer had the energy to be angry. I just felt deeply tired, as if I had walked a very long road to arrive at a place I could never return from. I didn't come here to argue, I said, And I didn't come here to listen to your justifications." Richard looked up, his eyes full of confusion. "Then, why did you come?" I looked around his office, the room where he had built his power, his reputation, and another part of his life. I thought of the family photo on his desk, the picture that now suddenly felt out of place. "I came to know the truth," I said, "and now I do." I turned and walked toward the door. Richard called my name, his voice breaking. "Margaret, please, we can talk more. I'll explain everything. We can figure something out." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. "No," I said very softly but firmly. "There is no we here anymore." I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. No one paid attention to me. The men and women outside continued with their work, their everyday conversations. The world didn't stop just because my marriage had collapsed. I walked straight to the elevator and pressed the button. When the doors closed, I finally allowed myself to let out a long breath. I didn't cry. I just felt empty. As the elevator went down, I looked at my reflection in the dim mirror. A 60-year-old woman standing straight, her eyes no longer unfocused. I knew very clearly that what I had left behind wasn't just Richard's office, but a marriage that had been dead for a long time. Only today, I had officially laid it to rest, and I also knew that when I stepped out of that building, I would never return in my old role again. I walked out of the building when the sun was higher than when I arrived, but the light didn't make me feel any warmer. The wind swept across the plaza in front of the entrance, carrying early fallen yellow leaves that brushed lightly against my feet before drifting away. Everything continued as usual. Cars, pedestrians, distant horns. Only I felt as if I had been pulled out of a familiar orbit. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls. I needed that quiet, like a fragile buffer between what I had just learned and what I was about to face. The road home was so familiar I could drive it without looking at the signs. I had taken this route for decades, driving the kids to school, going grocery shopping, coming home after teaching. Today, it felt longer than usual. The house came into view, the house I had once called home, the white-painted front, the maple trees in the yard that had grown tall over the years, their branches nearly covering the living room windows. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, my hands still on the steering wheel. Not because I wasn't ready to go inside, but because I wanted to remember this feeling, the feeling of standing in front of something familiar, knowing I was about to see it with different eyes. Inside, everything was the same. There was no sign that life here had ever been shared with another woman. Richard's coat still hung on the hook by the door. The shoes he wore most often were neatly placed under the shelf. The familiar scent of wood and mild cleaner still lingered in the air. If not for this morning, I would have thought everything was intact. I set my purse down on the table, took off my coat, and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure where to begin. I wasn't looking for an emotional outburst. I was looking for the truth. And I knew that if Richard had managed to hide another life from me for 15 years, there had to be traces. I went upstairs and entered our bedroom. That room had once been the place where I felt safest. Now it was simply a space that needed to be examined. I opened Richard's closet. Everything was arranged as neatly as ever, suits hanging by color, shirts folded carefully, ties rolled in a drawer. Nothing looked unusual on the surface. I began searching through the drawers, calmly, without panic. I had taught long enough to know that the truth rarely sits in obvious places. I checked the pockets of old suit jackets, the lower drawers where Richard kept, things he rarely used. Then I saw it, A small, dark wooden box tucked deep inside, hidden behind thick winter socks. The box wasn't large, but it felt heavier than I expected when I picked it up. It had a small lock. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. Richard had never mentioned it. I tried to open it, but it was locked. In that moment, I didn't hesitate. I opened the vanity drawer, took out the small scissors I used to cut loose threads, and gently pried at the lock. There was a dry click. The lid popped open. Inside were neatly arranged documents, as if someone had carefully organized their secret life. I took them out one by one and laid them on the bed. A lease agreement for an apartment on the other side of the city in Richard's name. The lease had started 15 years ago and had been renewed regularly. I recognized the area, not far from where his company once had a branch office. Next were bank statements, an account I had never known about, regular transfers, consistent, stretching over many years. Not impulsive spending from a temporary affair, but planned, responsible financial support. I didn't need to be an accountant to understand that. Then there were photographs. I picked up the first one, my heart sinking. Richard stood beside Lauren, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. They were at a beach, sunlight bright around them. His smile, the smile I hadn't seen in years. The next photo showed Richard holding a small child, then the child growing older in each frame. Birthdays, parks, dinner tables, a complete family recorded over time. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the photos spread out in front of me. There was nothing left to deny, nothing left to explain away. This wasn't a mistake. This was another life built alongside mine. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't in pain, but because every tear seemed frozen. I just sat there, looking at the undeniable evidence, letting the truth sink in. 15 years. While I lived with a husband I trusted completely, he had been a father to another child, a partner to another woman. I don't know how long I sat there. When I finally stood up, the light outside the window had shifted toward afternoon. I gathered the documents and placed them back into the wooden box, leaving it unlocked. There was no need anymore. I heard a car pull up outside. A car door closing. Richard was home. My heartbeat slowed, steadier now. I realized I was ready for this moment, even though I hadn't planned it. Richard walked into the house and called my name as usual. His voice echoed from downstairs, carrying the familiar tiredness. I picked up the wooden box and walked down the stairs. When he saw me standing there with the box in my hands, his eyes darkened. He understood immediately. No explanation was needed. "Margaret," he began. I raised my hand, signaling him to stop. "You don't need to say anything else," I said. My voice was steady. "I've seen enough." Richard stood still. His shoulders slumped, as if he finally no longer had the strength to hold himself upright. He looked at the box, then at me. I no longer saw the powerful man from earlier that day, just someone stripped of every disguise. "I want you to leave this house," I said slowly, each word deliberate. "Tonight." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He took a deep breath, then shook his head. "Margaret, we can talk. I'll explain. No," I interrupted. Not loudly, but firmly. "There's nothing left to explain. You had 15 years to talk. I don't owe you another minute." He looked around the house, as if only now realizing it was about to no longer be his. "This is my home," he said weakly. "No," I replied. "This was our home once. But you chose to live somewhere else a long time ago." Silence stretched between us. Finally, Richard nodded very slightly. He turned and went upstairs to pack. I stood at the bottom of the stairs listening to drawers open, clothes being pulled out. Each sound felt like a final period. When he came back down with a small suitcase, I opened the door for him. No tears, no pleading, just a clear ending that couldn't be reversed. The door closed behind Richard. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob. Then I turned back inside, closed the door, and locked it. For the first time in my life, I didn't compromise. I didn't convince myself to accept what was unacceptable. I didn't stay in a marriage that had been dead for a long time. I stood in the quiet house, took a deep breath, and knew that whatever lay ahead, I had just done the only thing left for me to do: choose myself. The next morning, I woke up very early, even though I had barely slept. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. No familiar footsteps in the kitchen, no refrigerator door opening, no soft cough I had heard for decades. I got up, put on my robe, and walked through the house, as if to confirm that I was truly alone now. The first thing I did was call a locksmith to change all the locks, not out of hatred, but because I needed a clear boundary. When the locksmith asked if I was sure, I nodded without hesitation. The old keys were removed, placed into his toolbox, and disappeared from my life in a very ordinary way. I realized that sometimes the biggest changes happen quietly. After that, I called a lawyer a friend had recommended years ago, someone I never thought I would need. The woman on the other end of the line was calm and professional. I didn't go into details. I simply said I needed advice about a divorce after many years of marriage, involving assets and long-term infidelity. She didn't sound surprised. She just scheduled a meeting later that week. When I hung up, I sat still for a moment, realizing I had taken another step away from my old life. But the hardest part was still ahead. I called my 2 children, one by one. I asked them to come over that evening, saying I had something important to talk about in person. My voice sounded normal, even to me. Maybe because if I had let the emotions surface then, I wouldn't have been able to finish the sentence. Both of them sensed something was wrong, but neither pressed for details. The afternoon passed slowly. I tidied the living room and brewed a pot of tea, as if preparing for an ordinary conversation, but nothing about that day was ordinary. When the doorbell rang, my heart tightened. My son came in first, followed by my daughter. Both looked around the house, then at me, their faces full of concern. "What's going on, Mom?" my daughter asked, gripping my hand tightly. I motioned for them to sit down. I sat across from them, my hands resting on my knees. I took a deep breath. I had stood in front of classrooms for decades, spoken about difficult topics with students, but I had never felt that telling the truth could be so heavy. "Your father doesn't live here anymore," I began. Both of them froze. My son frowned. "Did Dad go on a business trip?" I shook my head slowly. "No, your father has been living another life for 15 years. The air in the room thickened. I saw my daughter's eyes widen, as if she didn't understand what I had just said. My son sat up straight, his voice tense. "What are you saying?" I didn't go around it. I told them, without embellishment, without excuses. I spoke about the other woman, about 15 years of lies, about a child born from that relationship. I didn't give unnecessary details. I only said what needed to be said, what they had the right to know. When I finished, the room fell silent. My daughter lowered her head, tears falling onto her sleeve. My son stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his hands clenched. "That's impossible," he said. "Dad wouldn't do that." I stood up and placed my hand on his shoulder. "I used to think so too," I said softly. That moment hurt more than anything Richard had done to me. Watching my children, who had trusted their father completely, now forced to face this truth, felt like my heart was being torn apart. His betrayal of me was one thing, but the collapse I saw in my children's eyes, that was what nearly took my breath away. Does that mean we have a sister? My daughter asked, her voice shaking. I nodded. Yes. The answer left them both silent, not out of jealousy, but because too many emotions collided at once. Shock, confusion, pain, and a sense of loss they couldn't yet name. She's not at fault, I said immediately, before anything else could be said. No matter how hard this is to accept, that child is completely innocent. She didn't choose the circumstances she was born into. My son stopped pacing and looked at me. There was an anger in his eyes I had never seen before. Dad did this to you, he said. He did this to our family. I nodded. I know, but I won't turn this into a campaign to destroy him. I don't need to tear your father down to prove anything. The truth is heavy enough on its own. I looked at each of them. Your father was wrong. Very wrong. But I don't want you to carry hatred for the rest of your lives. You have the right to be angry, the right to be disappointed. But I hope you remember that how you face this also says something about who you are. My daughter broke down, leaning into my shoulder. I held her, feeling her body tremble. My son stood there, eyes red, struggling to hold himself together. I knew each of them was reacting in their own way. There was no right or wrong response in that moment. My family, my daughter choked up. Are we still a family, Mom? I stroked her hair, my voice slow but steady. Our family has been hurt, but we haven't lost our dignity. I haven't lost myself, and neither have you. I looked around the room, the place that once held laughter, dinners, and conversations that seemed ordinary at the time. A family isn't defined only by a marriage, I said. It's defined by how the people in it treat one another when everything falls apart. We sat together for a long time that night. There were questions I couldn't answer. There were emotions I could only listen to. I didn't force my children to forgive. I didn't ask them to take sides. I only said that I had made a decision for my own life and I would take responsibility for it. When my children left, the house fell silent again. But this time, I didn't feel as empty as I had the night before. I was exhausted, but it was a meaningful kind of exhaustion. I knew I had just been through one of the hardest conversations of my life, and I hadn't avoided it. I stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom and looked at the woman reflected there. No longer a wife standing behind a successful man. No longer someone who constantly compromised to keep the peace. I saw a woman standing upright, even though her shoulders were still heavy. My family had fallen apart in a way I never imagined, but I wasn't broken. I hadn't lost my self-respect, and in that moment I understood that from this day on, I would no longer live as Richard's wife. I began to stand up, not with anger, but with the clarity of a woman who had finally chosen to step out of someone else's shadow and walk on her own feet. 3 days after the night I told my children the truth, when the house had finally returned to the slow rhythm of someone living alone, my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering, as if my body already knew who was on the other end. Margaret? A woman's voice said, low and hesitant. This is Lauren. I didn't answer right away. I sat down in the armchair near the window, where the afternoon sunlight usually slanted through the curtains. In that moment, I didn't feel angry. I just felt deeply tired, as if I had walked a long road without stopping to rest. I know, I said after a few seconds. My voice was calm, not trembling at all. Richard told me that you know everything now, Lauren continued. I'm not calling to apologize on his behalf. I thought we should meet, if you think that's possible." I was silent. Part of me wanted to refuse immediately. I didn't owe that woman any explanation. But another part of me, the part that no longer ran away, understood that some meetings aren't for reconciliation, but for closure. "All right," I said, "once." We agreed to meet at a small cafe far from both my neighborhood and Richard's office area. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to wait, but to choose a seat that made me feel safe. I sat with my back to the wall, facing the door, a new habit I couldn't remember learning. Lauren walked in right on time. I recognized her immediately, even though she was dressed far more simply than the day I saw her at the office. No high heels, no fitted dress, just a neutral coat, dark jeans, her hair neatly tied back. She looked around, then spotted me. Her eyes paused for a brief moment before she walked over to the table. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting down across from me. I nodded. "Let's be direct," I replied. "I don't have much I want to hear." Lauren took a deep breath. "I understand." Neither of us ordered a drink right away. The air between us was tight, like a rope pulled too far, but there was no loud hostility. Just two women sitting across from each other, forced to truly see one another for the first time. "I knew about you from the beginning," Lauren said. She didn't avoid it. "Richard never said he was single." That didn't surprise me. It only confirmed what I had already guessed. I nodded slightly. "And yet you stayed," I said. "Yes," Lauren answered. "I told myself I wasn't the one breaking your family, that your marriage already had problems." I looked at her, neither smiling nor arguing right away. "You're very good at comforting yourself," I said. Not sarcastically, just honestly. Lauren lowered her head. "Maybe I am. I'm not proud of it." She told her story, not long-winded, no tears. She said she had never been a legal wife, never had the Harrison last name on any documents, never appeared openly at family events. She existed in a vague in-between, not a secret affair, but not a real wife either. "I lived like a wife without a name," she said, "in a rented apartment, at dinners without relatives, on holidays with just the three of us. 3 people, Richard, her, and the child. I used to believe I accepted that for my daughter," Lauren continued, "that I was sacrificing for her. But as time went on, I wasn't so sure anymore." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not through the eyes of a betrayed wife, but through the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to see that lies rarely have only one victim. "Do you know how I lived?" I asked. No anger, no accusation, just a question. Lauren shook her head. "I only knew you were there, like something taken for granted, like a shadow I tried not to look at directly." I exhaled softly. "I lived as a trusting wife," I said, "believing that silence meant peace, believing exhaustion was the price of success, believing that if I didn't ask questions, everything would be fine." We sat in silence for a moment. The server came by to ask for our order. I asked for hot tea. Lauren ordered black coffee. When the server left, I continued. "I didn't come here to forgive," I said, "and I don't think you need that from me." Lauren nodded. "I didn't expect it." "I just need to understand," I said, "so I don't carry hatred with me." Lauren looked at me, her expression softening for the first time. "If there's one thing I want you to know," she said, "it's that I never thought I won." I looked at her slowly. "I know. Because no one wins in a life built on division. Not the legal wife, Not the woman on the sidelines, not the child born into silence. The only person who benefited for a very long time was Richard. "I don't blame you," I said. "Not because you were right, but because I don't want to keep focusing on the wrong place." Lauren closed her eyes briefly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding. "Thank you for that," she said quietly. I stood up. "I think we've said enough." Lauren stood as well. "Margaret," she called, as I had already turned away. I stopped, but didn't turn around. "Do you love him?" I asked, surprising even myself. Lauren was silent for a long time. "I don't know," she finally said. I think I loved the role I was given, and when that role disappeared, I'm not sure what I have left." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I understand," I said. I walked out of the cafe and took a deep breath of the cool air outside. The feeling in my chest wasn't as heavy anymore, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer carried a distorted image of the other woman. She wasn't my enemy. She was part of the lie and had been hurt by it in her own way. The misplaced focus had never been on the two women standing on opposite ends of the story. It was on the man who chose silence for 15 years and called it protection. As I drove home, I realized my hands were no longer shaking. There was no tightness in my throat. I didn't forgive, but I didn't carry hatred either. And for me, at this stage of life, that already felt like a form of freedom. After that, time moved at a different pace, slower but clearer. No more days of waiting and uncertainty. No more guessing what time Richard would come home, whether he was tired, whether he was busy. My life no longer revolved around someone else, and at first that left me more confused than relieved. The divorce process moved faster than I expected, perhaps because Richard didn't resist. He signed every document quietly, exhausted. The assets were divided fairly, according to the law and according to what I deserved after 40 years together. The house remained mine. Part of his retirement was reallocated. There were no loud arguments, no painful tug of war. Everything ended in a cold, almost administrative way. And perhaps that was the most fitting end for a marriage that had been dead for a long time. The day I held the divorce decree in my hands, I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious either. I only felt a door closing behind me, softly but decisively. I stood outside the lawyer's building, watching people pass by, and for the first time in many years, I had no one to call, no one to share that moment with. And strangely, I didn't feel as empty as I had feared. In the days that followed, I began doing very small things, but for myself. I cleared out the room that had once been Richard's office. I took down the plaques, the old documents, the books he had left behind, not in anger, but with clarity. I repainted the walls a lighter color and placed a small wooden desk near the window. I bought a few green plants. The room gradually became something else, no longer marked by a powerful man, but by a woman learning how to live again. I found my old notebooks, yellowed pages where I had once written, scattered thoughts back when I was teaching. I started writing again. Not to tell Richard's story, but to listen to my own voice. I wrote about quiet mornings, about sunlight falling across the wooden floor, about the feeling of making tea for someone, myself, without needing to ask what they preferred. Some afternoons, I sat in the living room for a long time without turning on the television or playing music, just sitting there, listening to the ticking of the clock. At first, the silence made me uncomfortable. I had grown used to always having someone nearby, even if it was just a quiet presence. But slowly I realized silence wasn't an enemy. It was simply a space that had never been filled with my own voice. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. Some evenings I ate a simple meal and washed the dishes right away, not leaving them for the next day. Some mornings I woke up later than usual, brewed coffee, and read the newspaper slowly. I didn't have to report my schedule to anyone. I didn't have to adjust my habits to suit someone else. Those small things, which I had never thought about before, now brought me a strange sense of freedom. I called old friends, people I had been telling someday when I have time for years, without ever having time. We met at small restaurants and talked about things unrelated to family or responsibility. Some knew my story, some didn't. I no longer felt the need to explain my life to everyone. I only needed to be present as I was. One friend invited me to join an evening painting class. I almost refused out of habit, then stopped myself. I remembered that I used to enjoy painting a long time ago. So I went. I sat in a room filled with the scent of oil paint, holding a brush that felt unfamiliar, and let the colors spread freely across the paper. No one judged. No one compared. I didn't need to be good. I just needed to try. Solo trips came afterward naturally. At first, it was just a short drive to a coastal town I'd always wanted to visit, but kept postponing because it was inconvenient. I booked a small room, brought a book, and walked along the shore early in the morning. There was no one beside me, no one to talk to, but I didn't feel empty. I felt more observant of the waves, the birds, the strangers who were also walking alone. On those trips, I began to look back on my life through a different lens. I wasn't only a betrayed wife. I had been a dedicated teacher, a mother, a friend, and now I was an independent woman stepping into a new stage of life, even if that stage arrived later than I once imagined. There were still moments when sadness visited unexpectedly, like a cold gust of wind, seeing an elderly couple holding hands on the street, hearing an old song. Memories don't disappear just because you sign divorce papers, but they no longer controlled me. I allowed myself to remember, then allowed myself to move on. I realized I was slowly reclaiming my sense of self, not through dramatic changes, but through small, steady choices. I chose to wear the dress I liked without asking anyone's opinion. I chose to eat what I wanted. I chose to spend time on things that made me feel alive. Those choices, added together day after day, formed a person I thought I had lost. I no longer defined myself through marriage. I no longer introduced myself as someone's wife. When people asked if I was retired, I simply smiled and said I was enjoying a new chapter of life. No further explanation needed. One morning, I woke up and realized I was looking forward to the day, not because I had an appointment, not because I had something to do, but because I was curious how I would feel. That realization made me sit quietly on the bed for a long time, my hand resting on my chest, as if to make sure it was real. I wasn't younger. I hadn't forgotten the pain, but I was being reborn in the way of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that life isn't just about existing, but about being fully yourself, without a role to play. And for the first time in many years, that's how I felt I was living. I met Samuel Brooks on a very ordinary afternoon, in a way that, if someone had told me about it years earlier, I would have smiled politely and forgotten it. There was no fateful moment, no lightning strike glance, no racing heartbeat like in the stories people like to tell. Just a quiet afternoon and two people who had endured enough loss to no longer rush. That day, I went to the public library near my home to return a few books. It was early fall, the sunlight gentle, the air cool and fresh. I stopped at the magazine rack, flipping through a travel magazine about Europe that I was considering for an upcoming trip. As I put the magazine back, a man's voice spoke behind me, neither too close nor too far. "You like small towns? In the south of France, too?" I turned around. The man standing there was of average height, his gray hair neatly kept, wearing an old but clean jacket, his eyes calm and kind. Not the type trying to impress, no rushed, polite smile. Just someone genuinely curious. "I've never been," I replied, "but I like the idea of places that aren't noisy." He nodded as if my answer confirmed something he had already guessed. "I went once, many years ago, when my wife was still alive." He said it naturally, without sadness, without avoidance. I immediately recognized someone who had lived with loss long enough not to hide it. We talked for a few more minutes. About books, about traveling without packed schedules, about living alone after children grow up. When we parted, he introduced himself as Samuel Brooks. I simply nodded and smiled, not thinking that the brief conversation would continue. But a week later, I saw him again at the same library. This time, we sat at a table near the window, each reading a different book, occasionally exchanging a few scattered remarks. No one asked for a phone number. No one suggested meeting again. Just the presence of two people who didn't feel uncomfortable sharing silence together. Everything unfolded so slowly, it was almost unnoticeable. A coffee afterward, then another walk in the park. Samuel always walked half a step slower than I did, as if unconsciously adjusting his pace to match mine. He never asked intrusive questions. He wasn't overly curious about my past. When I spoke, he listened. When I was silent, he didn't try to fill the space. No promises were made. No lines like, "We will be this," or "our future." And strangely, that was exactly what made me feel safe. I had lived with too many empty promises, words used to postpone the truth. With Samuel, there were no expectations placed on my shoulders. We met only when we both wanted to. Some weeks we didn't see each other at all. Some days we exchanged just a short message. "The weather is nice today." No one complained. No one checked up on the other. No one demanded anything. What made me realize the biggest difference wasn't in gestures, but in how I was listened to. When I spoke, Samuel didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to give advice. He didn't compare my story to anyone else's. He listened as if what I said truly mattered, not as something to endure until it was his turn to speak. Once, when I was talking about the years I had lived in silence in my former marriage, I stopped halfway, afraid I was saying too much. Samuel looked at me and said very softly, "You don't have to summarize your life for me. I have time." That sentence made me turn my face away for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed with emotion, but because I realized how long it had been since anyone had told me they had time for me, not out of obligation, but by choice. I told my children about Samuel after a few months, not to ask permission, but because I didn't want to hide anything. My daughter listened carefully, then smiled. "You look different, Mom," she said, "not because there's someone new, but because you feel lighter." My son asked a few more practical questions, as was his nature. What Samuel did, where he lived, whether he was serious. I answered honestly. I didn't know, and I didn't need to know right now. What reassured me was that neither of them objected. They could see that I wasn't losing myself in this relationship. I still lived in my own house. I still had my own routine. I still traveled alone. Samuel was part of my life, not the center of it. Once he asked if I'd like to go with him to a small concert in a nearby town. I agreed. We sat next to each other in the small hall, soft lights, music flowing slowly. Samuel didn't hold my hand. He simply rested his hand on the armrest, close enough for me to know he was there. I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was continuing, but as a different version of myself, a version that didn't need to sacrifice herself to keep the peace, didn't need to stay silent to avoid conflict, didn't need to play the role of the understanding woman by accepting everything. Samuel didn't make promises. He didn't talk about a distant future, but he was always there at the right moments. When I caught a cold, he brought over a bag of hot soup and left it at the door, not coming inside unless I invited him. When I traveled, he wished me a good trip and didn't ask who I was going with. When I came back, he listened to my stories without impatience. Happiness came to me very gently. It didn't overwhelm me. It didn't make me lose my guard. It was simply a sense of peace, knowing I could share space and time with someone without having to make myself smaller. One morning, I brewed coffee and stood by the window watching the sunlight rise. I realized I was smiling for no particular reason. I didn't need to name happiness. I just needed to live in it, slowly, clearly, and fully, in the way of a woman who had learned that love isn't a trade-off, but coexistence. I received a call from my son early one morning, when the house was still wrapped in a thin layer of quiet. His voice on the other end sounded deeper than usual, with a hint of hesitation before he got straight to the point. "Mom, Dad's been hospitalized." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was shocked, but because I needed to identify my own feelings. The news didn't panic me. It passed through like a cold breeze, enough to remind me that some threads, even when cut, still leave marks. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice even. "His heart," my son replied. "Not critical, but not minor either. The doctors want to monitor him." I looked out the window where the early sunlight was filtering through the curtains. Samuel had left early, leaving a short note on the kitchen table. "I have a routine checkup today. I'll stop by tonight if you want." I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. I knew I would have to make a decision, not out of duty, but out of clarity. "I'll come by tonight," I said to my son, "not to stay, just to visit." Hospitals always have a particular smell, the scent of disinfectant, of waiting, of time stretched thin. I walked into the lobby and followed the signs to the cardiology ward. Every step was steady. I wasn't going as a wife. I was going as someone who had once shared a long chapter of life with the person lying in that room. When I arrived, both of my children were already there. My daughter stood up first and hugged me lightly. My son nodded, his fatigue clearly visible. I spoke with the doctor, listened to the necessary information. Stable condition, needs rest, needs time. Familiar, neutral words carrying no emotion. Then the hospital room door opened. Lauren was standing there. She looked different from the last time I saw her. Thinner, dark circles under her eyes, her hair hastily tied back. Beside her stood a teenage girl, reserved, her hands clasped together. I recognized her immediately. No introduction needed. The child had Richard's eyes. The space between us froze. Two families, two lives that had once run parallel, now collided in a narrow hallway. There were no polite greetings, no challenging looks, just the heavy awkwardness of people placed in a situation no one had wished for. My daughter stepped forward naturally. "I'm Anna," she said to the girl. "If you want, we can sit together." The girl looked up at Lauren, then at Anna, and nodded very slightly. That moment tightened my chest, not with pain, but because I saw something adults often forget. Children don't carry adults' histories. They only carry their own confusion. I looked at Lauren. She looked back at me, her eyes no longer guarded, only tired. We didn't speak. There was no need. When it was my turn to go into the room, I went in alone. Richard lay on the bed, looking smaller than I remembered, not because illness had weakened him too much, but because in that stark white space, there were no titles, no roles, just a person. He opened his eyes when he heard the door. His gaze settled on me, startled at first, then softened. There was no panic, no expectation. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yes," I replied. I pulled a chair closer and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "How are you?" "Better than this morning," he said. "The doctor says I need rest." We sat in silence for a moment, the steady hum of machines, footsteps in the hallway. I didn't know what I had come to say, but I knew I hadn't come to accuse him. I thought, "You wouldn't come," Richard said quietly. "I came," I replied without emphasizing the subject, "but not in the way you think." He looked up at the ceiling and took a deep breath. "I've thought a lot," he said, "in the past few hours. Times like this usually make people think," I said. "I regret it," he said, turning to look at me. "Not just because everything fell apart, but because I thought I could control everything. I was wrong." I looked at him without avoiding his gaze. "I know." "I don't expect you to come back," he said quickly, as if afraid I might misunderstand. "I know, that's over." I exhaled, relieved by those words. "Yes," I said, "it's over." There were no pleas to return, no late promises, just the bare acknowledgement of someone who had reached the end of a life built on lies and realized it led nowhere. "Are you happy?" Richard asked very softly. The question came unexpectedly, but it didn't upset me. I thought of gentle sunlight in the morning, of coffee by the window, of Samuel in the way he never rushed to take up my space. "I'm at peace," I said, "and that's enough." Richard closed his eyes. I didn't know what he was thinking, and I didn't need to know. I stood up. "I'll let you rest," I said. "The kids are outside." He nodded. "Thank you for coming." I didn't reply. I just smiled very faintly and turned away. When the door closed behind me, I knew that was the last time I would step into the role of his past. There was nothing left to say. Out in the hallway, Lauren stood up when she saw me. She didn't come closer. She just looked at me, as if waiting for a signal. I nodded slightly. Not reconciliation, but acceptance that we had passed through the same pain in different ways. "Thank you," Lauren said. Just one word. I nodded again. "Take care of the girl," I said. "She needs stability." Lauren nodded, her eyes reddening. I turned to the girl. "You have beautiful eyes," I said. She looked surprised, then smiled shyly. That was enough. When I left the hospital, I paused outside for a moment and took a deep breath of the evening air. I called Samuel. "I'm done," I said. "I'm okay." "I'm on my way," he replied. "No rush. Take your time." I ended the call and walked slowly toward the parking lot. No resentment. No clinging. The past had knocked one last time, and I had opened the door, not to go back, but to see it out. As I drove home, the street lights came on one by one, illuminating the road ahead. I realized I was no longer carrying unanswered questions. I didn't need validation from my former life. I didn't need a dramatic ending. I only needed acceptance, and I had it. For the first time in many years, I felt truly free. The following spring arrived more gently than I expected. There was no grand moment marking it, no bells announcing a new beginning, just mornings with earlier sunlight, new buds appearing on the trees in the yard, and a sense of peace as I opened the windows and let the breeze flow through a house that now bore my own imprint. Samuel and I didn't talk much about big plans. We sat together at the kitchen table, spread out an old map, and marked a few places we wanted to visit when the weather warmed. A small coastal town he had once mentioned. A historic city I had always been curious about. No packed schedules, no long-term promises, just plans enough to make us smile when we thought about them. I liked the way Samuel asked for my opinion, listened, then nodded slowly, as if every choice deserved consideration. I no longer had to squeeze myself into someone else's plans. I was a companion, not someone walking behind. On weekends, my children and grandchildren came over more often. We cooked together, laughter filling the newly painted kitchen. I hung my paintings, placed green plants on the windowsills, replaced the sofa with a color I loved. The house was no longer a place that stored old compromises. It became a space shaped by choices I made with my own hands. Every corner told a new story, not loud, not showy, but warm enough to make people want to stay. Some afternoons, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch, listening to the wind move through the leaves. I realized I was no longer afraid of being alone. Silence was no longer a frightening void, but a place where I could rest. I knew how to brew a cup of tea just the way I liked it, when to go out and see others, and when to stay in. I didn't need anyone to fill my time. I just needed time lived at the right rhythm. Sometimes I looked back on the journey. From the moment I stood frozen in the company lobby, hearing someone else called by my title, to the night I changed the locks and told my children the truth, to the honest meeting with the other woman, to the day I signed the divorce papers and the first morning I woke up to a life no longer defined by marriage. I didn't romanticize the pain. I simply placed it where it belonged in memory, as pieces that had completed their purpose and no longer needed to be carried in my pocket every day. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't don't trust anyone, but don't lose yourself. Self-respect isn't loud. It shows up in small decisions, knowing when to say no, refusing to compromise with what hurts you, having the courage to stand upright before the truth. Identity isn't a label attached to a role. It's the inner feeling of living in alignment with your values, whether you're beside someone or alone. I am enough, even on my own, but I am also open enough to welcome the kind presence of another. Samuel walks beside me, not leading, not pulling me along. He walks with me, and that is enough. When we talk about the future, they aren't promises that make me lose the present, but plans that allow the present to be cherished more deeply. One morning, I hung a newly taken family photo on the wall. My children, my grandchildren, smiles that needed no explanation. I stepped back and looked at the house as a whole. The light fell in the right places. Nothing was perfect, but everything was real. I realized my new life hadn't begun on the day of the divorce, nor when I met Samuel. It began the moment I chose myself, and it continues every day I hold that choice steady. A new life doesn't announce itself loudly. It opens quietly when we stop being afraid. I don't know what challenges lie ahead, but I know I will face them with steadier feet, a wider heart, and a simple belief that I deserve my own peace. If you've walked with me all the way to these final lines, I want you to know that your presence is not small. Somewhere out there, you may be listening to this story on a quiet evening or in the middle of a long, thoughtful day, and that's enough for us to meet in the same emotional rhythm. Where are you listening from? What city or country? Please tell me, so I can feel how far this journey has reached you. If, in the pages of life I've just shared, there was a moment that made you pause, nod, or see yourself reflected there, please leave a comment. even just one sentence. I read every word with gratitude. And if you feel this story has given you a little warmth, a little courage to choose yourself, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in future stories. Life doesn't end when we lose something. It truly begins when we dare to live in alignment with our values. Thank you for listening and for being here. The basement door had barely closed when I heard the lock click above my head. I spun around, my heart pounding wildly. "Daniel?" I called my son's name, my voice trembling. There was no answer. Only my daughter-in-law's voice floated down, cold and flat. "Just stay down there, the doctor's on the way." Before I could even understand what was happening, my husband leaned close to my ear and whispered something that sent a chill straight through me. "Don't panic. They don't know what's hidden behind that wall." I followed his gaze, and for the first time after 46 years of marriage, I realized I had never truly known the man standing beside me. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. For the first few seconds, I stood frozen in the familiar basement that had suddenly become foreign. The old ceiling bulb swayed slightly, its weak yellow light spilling over stacked cardboard boxes, old Christmas decorations, family photo albums, a few wooden chairs with broken legs that Howard had always refused to let me throw away. I had come down here countless times over more than 30 years of living in this lakeside house, but never had it felt so small and suffocating. "Howard, I don't understand," I whispered, my hand gripping his arm like a survival reflex. "They locked the door." I rushed to the stairs and yanked hard on the doorknob. It didn't budge. I pounded my hands against the wooden door, the sound echoing back hollow and frighteningly weak. "Daniel, what are you doing?" "Open this door right now." My voice broke apart, no longer holding the calm of a mother used to protecting, used to enduring. From upstairs, I heard footsteps moving away. Then Claire's voice drifted down again, still even, still carrying that fake sweetness I had grown used to hearing over the past 5 years. "Please stay calm. We just want everything to go smoothly. The doctor will be here soon." The doctor. The word rang in my head like an alarm bell. Not because I was afraid of hospitals or white coats, but because I understood all too well that in this world it only takes one doctor's signature for an elderly person's entire life to be sealed shut. I turned to look at Howard. He wasn't running to the door. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pounding on anything. He was simply standing there, back straight, eyes strangely clear, completely unlike the 72-year-old man my son had just described as starting to decline. "Howard," I swallowed hard, "what are they planning to do to us?" He placed both hands on my shoulders and gave a gentle squeeze, just enough to make me feel that he was here, truly here. "Margaret," he said softly, "do you remember how I once told you that some things are safer the less you know?" I frowned. Decades of marriage flashed through my mind, quiet dinners, short vacations, weekend mornings on the porch watching the lake shimmer. Howard had never been a mysterious man. He was a construction engineer, principled, orderly, someone who hated complications. He wasn't the type to keep secrets. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice dropping. Instead of answering, he tilted his head, signaling me to be quiet. We stood completely still for a few seconds, listening. Upstairs, I heard Daniel speaking in a low, urgent voice, followed by footsteps pacing back and forth. Maybe they were waiting or calling someone. Howard gently pulled me back, away from the stairs, toward the old brick wall at the far end of the basement. A chill ran through me. I had been looking at that wall for decades, dark bricks, some chipped, others stained with damp patches from the lake's moisture. "Do you remember," Howard whispered, "when you asked me why I never let anyone repair this section of the wall?" My heart started racing. I remembered. I had complained that it looked ugly, that it ruined the house I loved showing off to friends every summer. Howard had just smiled and said, "It's fine the way it is." "You said it was convenient," I stammered. He nodded. "That's right, convenient." A small noise came from upstairs, maybe the front door opening. I heard Claire say faintly, "Yes, we're waiting." I began to understand, not through logic, but through the instinct of a mother, of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize when something was no longer about family. This morning, everything had started to go wrong the moment Daniel walked in with a smile that was far too practiced. My son was not a man who smiled easily. I had raised him for 43 years. I knew him well. Daniel smiled freely only when he was a child, when his father taught him how to fish, when I baked apple pie for Thanksgiving. Since marrying Claire, his smiles had become conditional. "Mom, Dad," Claire had said in a voice light as a feather, "we think it's time to have a serious conversation about your future." Future, a word that sounds beautiful, but for older people it is often used as the opening line for decisions they are not allowed to refuse. That was why, when the basement door locked, I no longer thought this was a misunderstanding. I understood perfectly. This was a plan, and it had been prepared for a long time. I looked back at Howard. Under the dim yellow light, his face looked older than usual, but his eyes did not. They were sharp and alert, like when he was still working, whenever he spotted an error in a blueprint. "Howard," I lowered my voice, almost pleading, "if you know what's going on, you have to tell me." He was silent for a few seconds. I could feel the struggle inside him, between the habit of protecting me with silence and the reality that this time, silence could kill both of us. "I never meant for you to find out this way," he said slowly, "but maybe now is the time." He took another step toward the old brick wall. I followed, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid it could be heard. His hand lifted, brushing lightly across the bricks, stopping at one darker than the rest. In that exact moment, I understood why he had been so calm when his own son locked us in the basement, and I knew that the life I thought had finally settled at 69 had just officially turned in a completely different direction. Howard was still standing in front of the brick wall, his hand resting lightly on that darker brick, but he didn't do anything yet. He looked at me, his eyes signaling me to wait, and in that moment, the memory of this morning flooded back, so vivid, I could almost smell the coffee steaming in the kitchen again, hear the lake birds outside, and feel that vague unease I had tried to brush aside. The morning had begun far too perfectly. Daniel and Claire arrived earlier than usual. Too early. My son rarely stopped by before 10, always blaming traffic or meetings. Yet today, just after 8, I heard a car pull into the driveway. When I opened the door, Claire stood there with an overly wide smile, almost deliberate, holding a box of pastries from my favorite bakery in town. "Mom, I know you like blueberry," she said, her voice sweet as honey. Daniel stood behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, nodding as he explained, "We just thought, it's been a long time since we had a serious family talk." That single sentence sent a chill down my spine. Serious talks in families rarely bring good news, especially when they come with pastries and forced smiles. We sat around the kitchen table. Morning sunlight streamed through the large window overlooking the lake, reflecting off the calm water. I remember thinking, how strange, on such a beautiful morning to feel so heavy inside. Claire began. She was always good at this. "Lately you've been looking more tired," she said. placing her hand on mine, a gesture I once thought was caring, but now, looking back, felt controlling. You're always worrying about Dad, about the house, about everything. I think you deserve to rest. I was about to brush it off with a laugh, but before I could speak, Daniel continued, his voice slow and careful, like he was reading from a rehearsed script. And Dad, he's been forgetting things lately, he said. Last week, he even forgot a doctor's appointment. Howard looked up from his newspaper. I didn't forget. I rescheduled. Daniel avoided his father's eyes. Claire immediately cut in. But the doctor said it already. Little signs like that, we shouldn't ignore them. I set my coffee cup down on the table. The soft clink sounded louder than usual. Which doctor? I asked. Claire smiled. Dr. Cole, the one I introduced last time. I remembered that visit very clearly, a completely routine checkup, where Howard answered every question clearly, even joking that he remembered his doctor's schedule better than his own birthday. Claire leaned closer to me, lowering her voice into something intimate and concerned. Mom, we're just worried. People say at this stage many older folks don't realize they're getting weaker. I realized I was being placed into an invisible box, one labeled elderly and lacking self-awareness. Then Claire mentioned a name I had never heard before, Silver Haven Residence. It's a wonderful place, she said, her eyes lighting up, a high-end senior living facility like a resort, private rooms, doctors on duty, 24 hours, an indoor pool, a book club. You'd love it. We already went to see it, Daniel added, unable to hide his enthusiasm this time. The scenery is beautiful. Security is great. You and Dad wouldn't have to worry about anything. I remember asking, very slowly, very carefully, how much does it cost? Claire hesitated for just a breath, then answered as if it were nothing. About $8,500 a month, for both of you. I did the math quickly in my head. $8,500 a month, more than $100,000 a year. I looked at Daniel, then at Claire. My son worked in sales, his income unstable. Claire worked at a bank, earning a decent salary, but not enough to casually cover a number like that. And who's paying? I asked. The air in the kitchen suddenly grew heavy. Claire looked at Daniel. Daniel sighed as if I were the one being difficult. You have this house, he said, his tone softer but no longer respectful. It's too big for just the two of you anyway. Selling it would be enough to take care of the future. The lakeside house. The house Howard and I bought with a 30-year mortgage. The house where Daniel grew up, where he learned to swim off the wooden dock in the backyard, where I once sat sewing his high school graduation gown. And now it was being spoken of as a number in a calculation. So, I said slowly, you want to sell your parents' house, put us in a nursing home, and then, what about the rest? Claire rushed to answer. You're misunderstanding. Everything is for you. The remaining money will be managed carefully. You won't have to worry about anything. I looked at Howard. He folded his newspaper and sat up straight. No, he said. Just one word. Clear, final. Dad, Daniel began. I said no, Howard repeated. We're not selling the house, and we're not going anywhere. I had never seen Claire's expression change so fast. The smile on her lips froze, then vanished, revealing something colder and harder underneath. Howard, she said, calling him by his name for the first time without Dad. The doctor has already been clear. You're not in the best condition to make decisions anymore. I felt the blood rush to my face. What are you talking about? Claire turned to me, her eyes carrying a carefully polished look of pity. Mom, you're always protecting Dad, but have you thought that you might be exhausted too? The words were like a velvet-wrapped knife. They didn't draw blood right away, but they cut deep. Daniel stood up, pulling his chair back with a harsh scrape against the floor. "You should think carefully. We've already prepared the paperwork." "What paperwork?" I asked. Claire opened her purse and pulled out a thick folder. I glanced at it and saw familiar but terrifying words. Property transfer, legal power of attorney, capacity evaluation. Howard stood up. He didn't raise his voice, but it hardened. "I'm not signing anything." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Then Daniel said the sentence that, even now, standing in this cold basement, I still hear word for word. "You're no longer clear-headed enough to make your own decisions." From that moment on, everything was decided. Now, standing in this cold basement, I understood that this morning had never been a family discussion. It was the first trial, and the verdict had already been written. They were just waiting for us to sign. Howard turned to look at me. His eyes were no longer those of the gentle older husband I was used to, but of a man who had been preparing for this for a very long time. "You see," he said quietly, "this wasn't sudden." I nodded, my throat dry. Above us, I heard footsteps returning, faster this time. Howard took a deep breath. Then he turned fully toward the old brick wall, and I knew that what I had once believed was my peaceful past had just been violently torn open. Howard had just turned fully toward the brick wall when, above our heads, I heard a phone ring. It wasn't Daniel's familiar ringtone, but Claire's, sharp and short. The sound echoed down into the basement through the stairwell gap, cold and clear, so sharp it felt like someone had knocked directly against my temple. "Yes, doctor." Claire's voice came through, smooth and terrifyingly calm. "I think their condition has worsened." I froze. Howard stopped. He didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly, a tiny, lightning-fast reaction, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "I know," Claire continued, lowering her voice, though every word still reached my ears. "The delusions are more obvious now. They believe we're conspiring against them. Yes, especially her. Me." I clapped a hand over my mouth instinctively, as if afraid that even breathing too loudly would be taken as proof of so-called delusions. My heart began to race, pounding so hard I felt dizzy. "Yes, Dr. Raymond Cole," Claire went on, sounding as though she were reading from a report. "We followed all the instructions. No, they're not cooperative. The husband is still very stubborn. Yes, I think a direct evaluation is necessary." There was a brief silence. I imagined a man on the other end nodding, taking notes, confirming a script that had already been written. "We brought them down to the basement so they could calm down," Claire said, and this time she didn't even lower her voice. "Just temporary isolation. Isolation." The word echoed in my head, heavy and cold. Not a bedroom. Not the living room, the basement. I turned to look at the stairs. The wooden door above was still firmly shut. I didn't hear Daniel anymore. Only Claire's voice, and my son's silence was more frightening than anything she could have said. "The doctor will arrive within 45 minutes, Claire concluded. "Thank you, doctor." The call ended with a dry, hollow beep. In that moment, I had no doubts left. This wasn't a family argument that had gotten out of hand. This was a procedure, a process, and we, Howard and I, were simply its subjects. I stepped backward until my back hit an old wooden shelf. My knees weakened. I had to grab the shelf to keep from collapsing. "They're going to declare us incompetent," I whispered, my voice trembling so badly it startled even me. "Howard, they're really going to do it." He turned to look at me. His eyes weren't panicked. On the contrary, they were so calm it scared me. "I know," he said. Just 2 words, but they struck my chest like a blow. "You know?" I shook my head. "Since when?" "Howard, they just called a doctor. They're building a story, and that doctor is coming to confirm it. Since Claire started asking me about my memory, he replied evenly. Since Daniel asked if I still remembered my bank card PIN, since they started talking more about responsibility and safety than about family. I closed my eyes. Fragmented memories snapped together into a picture that was painfully clear. Questions that had seemed harmless. Concern that sounded like care, but was really inspection. Daniel? I whispered my son's name, as if saying it might somehow turn everything back to the way it was. How could you let this happen? I looked up at the stairs, as if I could see through the wooden door and into his face. In my mind, I saw Daniel as a little boy, brown-haired, scraped knees, running toward me after every fall from his bicycle. The child who once sobbed uncontrollably just at the thought that his parents might be angry with him. Now that same child was standing upstairs, silently letting his wife call a doctor to declare his mother delusional. Daniel couldn't avoid this, Howard said softly, as if reading my thoughts. He's already made his choice. I spun around. No, he's just being manipulated by Claire. You know Daniel. He's not that cruel. Howard didn't argue. He only looked at me, his eyes filled with both compassion and resolve. Have you noticed, he said, that he hasn't looked you in the eye once since this morning? The words stopped me cold. I replayed it in my mind, in the kitchen, when I asked about the money, when I asked about the paperwork. Daniel had always looked down at the table or over at Claire. Not once had he met my eyes. My heart twisted. Above us, I heard footsteps. Then Daniel's voice came down the stairs, for the first time since the door had been locked. "Mom!" he called, his voice no longer shaking, but no longer warm either. "Just stay calm. This is for your own good." I rushed toward the stairs and grabbed the wooden railing. "What are you doing, Daniel?" I screamed. "Do you realize that locking your parents up like this is illegal?" There was no immediate answer. I heard Claire whisper something to him, too quietly for me to hear, but long enough for me to understand that my opinion no longer mattered. "The doctor is just coming to evaluate," Daniel said afterward. "If everything's fine, you'll be allowed back to your room." Back to your room. Not opening the door, not apologizing, not letting us out, but allowed back to your room. A wave of panic surged through me, fast and violent. My heart pounded so hard I had to press a hand to my chest. The air in the basement felt thick, hard to breathe. "Howard," I gasped, "I can't breathe." He stepped to me immediately, placing a hand on my back, rubbing it in slow, steady circles. "Look at me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Breathe in. Now breathe out. Slowly." I did as he said, though tears were already spilling over. In my mind, the worst possibilities lined up one after another. I had heard too many stories. With just one word, incompetent, I could lose the right to make decisions about my property, my home, even my own medical care. They could take me anywhere, keep me there, and call it care. "Howard," I whispered, tears running down my chin. "If that doctor signs the papers, what do we do?" He looked straight into my eyes. "That's why I've been staying calm." The words sent a chill through me. Not fear, realization. The man standing in front of me was no longer the gentle, older husband I had known in daily life. "They think this basement is isolation," he continued, his voice low and clear. "But to me, it's something else." "What?" I asked, barely breathing. Howard turned his head, scanning the basement. Every corner, every shadow, every old brick. He didn't answer right away. "Margaret," he said finally, "do you trust me?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then listen to me," he said. "No matter what you hear upstairs, no matter what they say, don't react on instinct. Don't argue. Don't try to prove you're lucid. Let them believe they're in control. I swallowed hard. Why? He stepped toward the brick wall again. His hand rested once more on that darker brick, this time firmly. Because, he said, in this kind of game, the person who thinks they've already won is usually the one who loses the fastest. Above us, I heard a car pull up outside, doors closing, new footsteps, heavier, slower. The doctor had arrived. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the entire basement could hear it. I looked at Howard, then at the old brick wall, and for the first time since the basement door had slammed shut behind me, I understood that my greatest fear was no longer being declared incompetent. It was about to learn the truth my husband had been hiding for nearly half a lifetime. The footsteps above grew closer, but Howard didn't turn around. He stood close to the old brick wall, his hand placed exactly on that darker brick I had seen for decades without ever noticing. Under the basement's weak yellow light, it looked no different from the others, old, rough, anonymous. If not for this moment, I would never have believed that something so ordinary could change an entire life. Howard took a deep breath. I watched his chest rise and fall, slow and controlled. He pressed his thumb lightly against the brick. At first, nothing happened. My heart pounded. I even thought I had imagined it, that this was just a hopeless attempt to calm me in the middle of panic. Then suddenly, a very small click sounded. Not loud, not dramatic, but in the enclosed space of the basement, it was so clear that goosebumps rose on my skin. Howard pushed the brick inward, not forcefully, not prying, but with a familiar motion, as if he had done this many times before. A thin seam appeared between the surrounding bricks. Then an entire section of the wall shifted slightly to the side, revealing a narrow black gap. My mouth fell open, but no words came out. Howard slid his hand into the opening and pulled gently. The whole section of wall moved aside like a hidden door. Behind it was not concrete or dirt, as I had always assumed, but a completely different space. Darker, deeper, and terrifyingly organized. "My God," I whispered, my voice breaking. Howard reached inside and flipped a small switch. White light flooded on. Not the old basement bulb, but sharp modern lighting, the kind I'd only ever seen in offices or professional workspaces. I stood frozen. Inside was a sealed room, not large but obsessively neat. Metal shelves lined both walls, stacked with carefully labeled file boxes. A work desk sat in the center, holding a fairly new desktop computer, a small printer, and a thick bundle of documents tied neatly together. In the corner, a dark gray safe rested against the wall, heavy and solid. I stepped forward once, then stopped, as if afraid that one more movement might make everything collapse. "Howard," I turned to him, my throat dry. "What is this?" He closed the hidden door behind us. When the wall slid back into place, the outer basement seemed to disappear entirely, leaving us in a separate space, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "I meant to tell you," he said, his voice low and steady, "but not now. Not like this." I let out a shaky, breathless laugh. "Are you kidding me? Howard, I've lived in this house for 30 years. I've cleaned every corner, every stair. I thought I knew every brick in it." He looked at me, a flicker of regret crossing his eyes. "I know." I slowly turned in a circle, my hand brushing over the file shelves, touching labels with years, locations, names. They weren't family papers, not bills or renovation contracts. They looked like evidence. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "Almost 24 years, he replied. 24 years. The number hit me like a slap. 24 years. Nearly as long as we'd owned this house. All that time, I said slowly, I knew nothing. Howard sat down in the chair by the desk. Suddenly, he looked visibly older. His shoulders sagged, his back curved slightly, as if the weight he'd carried for so long had finally been set down. "I wanted you to be safe," he said. "I wanted you to live a normal life." I swallowed. "And you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a drawer, pulled out a thick folder, and placed it on the desk. On its cover was a year that made my blood run cold, 2001. "I didn't retire," Howard said, no longer evasive. "I disappeared." I looked at him, then at the folder. A memory surfaced. The day he came home earlier than usual, more than 20 years ago. I remembered asking him about it and him saying the company was restructuring, that he'd decided to step away. "I was the lead supervising engineer," he continued, "for a major project in the northern suburbs of the city, a 12-story commercial building. I heard the name of that city, heard that location, and a cold sensation ran straight down my spine. I had seen it on the news before, a long time ago. It collapsed one morning," Howard said, his voice steady, "during rush hour. 52 people died." I raised a hand to cover my mouth. Old, blurry images in my memory suddenly became brutally sharp. Piles of concrete, ambulances, blankets covering motionless bodies. "You? You were involved?" I asked, my voice barely sounding like my own. "I warned them," he said, 3 times. I wrote reports. I demanded construction be halted because the materials didn't meet standards. He opened the folder, flipped through a few pages quickly, then turned it toward me. I saw copies of emails, technical notes, Howard's signature at the bottom of the pages. "They ignored it," he went on, "because replacing the materials would have cost an extra $2 million. And when the building collapsed..." He stopped and took a deep breath. "They needed someone to take responsibility." I understood before he finished. "You." Howard nodded. "They forged my signature, said I had approved everything. The media needed a name, the authorities needed a culprit, and I was the perfect choice." I staggered back a step, gripping the table to stay upright. I looked at the man in front of me, the husband who had slept beside me for 46 years, and realized I had never known this part of his life. "They threatened me," Howard said, his voice lowering. "Not just me, you, and Daniel, who was just a boy back then." My heart tightened. "Threatened how?" "Accidents," he said simply. "Things that look like accidents." A heavy silence settled over the hidden room. I could hear cars passing somewhere far away, as if from another world. "So you stayed silent," I whispered. Howard nodded. "I walked away from everything. I came home. I became an ordinary husband, an ordinary father, and I began documenting." He gestured around the room. "Everything here is what I couldn't say out loud. Evidence, names, money trails, other deaths." I was trembling. "You lived with this alone for 24 years. Not completely alone," he said. "I had you, but I couldn't pull you into it." I looked at the safe in the corner, the computer still glowing, then back at Howard. Tears had started spilling without me noticing. "You thought I was that fragile?" I asked, not accusing, just aching. Howard stood and stepped in front of me. He placed his hand against my cheek as gently as the first day we met. "No," he said. "I thought you were too strong." Above us, I heard the basement door open. Claire's voice rang down, cold and controlled. "The doctor is here. Are you ready?" Howard looked at me one last time, his eyes firmer than ever. "Margaret," he said, "from this moment on, nothing will be the same." I nodded, tears running down my cheeks, because I knew that the secret buried for 24 years had just been unearthed, Claire's voice still echoed in my ears, but inside the hidden room behind the false wall, time seemed to slow. Howard stood at the desk, one hand resting on the thick folder, while I sat down on the metal chair beside it, my mind spinning under the weight of the truth that had just crashed down on me. "How long have you been watching them?" I asked, my voice hoarse from crying. Howard didn't answer right away. He opened the left drawer and took out an old notebook, its cover worn, the edges of the pages yellowed. He placed it in front of me and said slowly, 23 years. I opened the first page. The dates were written carefully, Howard's handwriting painfully familiar. The first page held a single line, Black Ridge Development. Surveillance begins. Black Ridge Development. The name wasn't unfamiliar. I had seen it on billboards along the highway, on newly built office towers. In business articles Howard used to skim in the mornings. A large, successful corporation, praised as a symbol of modern urban development. "Their chairman is Victor Harlan," Howard said, as if mentioning an old acquaintance, "one of the most powerful men in this state." I looked up at him. "You know him?" Howard gave a thin smile. "Not socially, but I know him very well." He pulled a file box from the shelf and opened it. Inside were copies of contracts, expense statements, printed emails, everything organized by year, by project, by name. "After the collapse in 2001, Howard said, I started there, not for revenge, but to understand." "Understand what?" I asked. "Why a building could collapse like that," he replied, "and why the people truly responsible kept building, kept being celebrated." I skimmed a few pages. The numbers staring back at me were no longer familiar household expenses, but sums so large they made me dizzy. Howard pointed to a ledger. "This," he said, "bribes, disguised as consulting fees." He flipped to another page. "This is money laundering. Subsidiaries, shell companies, routed through 3 states, then back again." Each page he turned felt like another blade cutting deeper into my understanding of the world I thought I lived in. I had believed these things existed only in newspapers and on television. I never imagined they were hidden right beneath my feet, behind an old brick wall. "They signed contracts for cheaper materials," Howard continued, his voice even, like someone who had told this story too many times in his own head. "They falsified inspection reports, and if anyone noticed—" He stopped, his eyes darkening. "Then that person went silent." "How?" I asked. Though I already suspected the answer, Howard pulled 3 photographs from another file and laid them on the desk in front of me. 3 men, 3 different faces, but they shared something in common. Serious, intelligent eyes. 3 engineers, he said. They worked for Black Ridge. They asked questions. I picked up one photo. Accidents, Howard said. One fell from scaffolding. One died in a gas line explosion at home. One was hit by a car while jogging. I shuddered. And no one questioned it? Some did, he replied. But suspicion isn't enough. Not when you're up against money, politics, and connections you can't see. I set the photos down, my hands shaking. You lived with all of this, and still came home, had dinner with me, took our son to school. Howard nodded slightly. I had to, so no one would suspect anything, so you and Daniel would be safe. And you? I asked. He smiled sadly. I wasn't on the priority list. I turned away, not wanting him to see my tears, but in that small room there was nowhere to hide. You keep everything here? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. Not just here, Howard said. This is only part of it. He turned on the computer. The screen lit up, showing an interface I had never seen on his home computer. Encrypted folders, files labeled with initials, dates, codes. Everything has backups, he explained, in multiple locations, multiple formats. I looked at him, feeling both proud and terrified. If something happens to you? Howard nodded as if he'd been waiting for that question. Then everything is released automatically. Released? I repeated. Sent to the press, sent to investigators, sent to people they can't silence all at once. My scalp went numb. You prepared for your own death. Howard shook his head. I prepared for the truth. A soft sound came from above, like a door closing. I held my breath. Howard glanced at his watch. They think they're controlling the situation, he said quietly, but locking us down here triggered the emergency protocol. What protocol? I asked. He turned to me, more serious than I had ever seen him. Emergency protocol. He typed quickly on the keyboard. A small window appeared on the screen, a countdown ticking away. This is a safeguard, he said. If I don't confirm my safety status within a certain time, the system starts sending the data. My heart pounded. Howard, you planned for this. From the day I realized they would eventually come for me, he replied, and possibly through my own family. I lowered my head, guilt flooding in. If I had known sooner. He placed his hand over mine. You couldn't have changed this, and I didn't want you living in fear all those years. I took a deep breath. So what now? Howard looked at the screen, then at me. Now I take the next step. He opened another drawer and pulled out a phone I had never seen before. Small, black, no logo. This phone isn't tied to any personal account, he said. It can't be traced the usual way. I realized I was shaking. Who are you calling? Howard looked at me for a long moment as if making sure I was ready to hear the answer. The FBI, he said. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. In my mind, the peaceful life I thought I had shattered into pieces. You've been working with them all this time? I finally managed. Not officially, Howard replied. Not until now. He glanced back at the countdown on the screen, the numbers slowly decreasing. But now, he said, it's time. Above us, I heard shoes pacing, Daniel and Claire's voices drifting down, indistinct. They had no idea that, right beneath their feet, a chain of events had been set in motion. One Howard had prepared for 23 years. Howard raised the phone to his ear. Before dialing, he looked at me. Margaret, he said, his voice low and firm. From this moment on, there's no turning back. I nodded, my heart racing. We lost the chance to turn back the moment they locked the basement door, I replied. Howard gave a faint smile, then dialed. And in that instant, I knew that everything we had once called peace had only been the silence before the storm. Howard set the phone down on the desk. The computer screen in front of us was still glowing. I expected him to say something to reassure me, or at least explain the next step. Instead, he quietly opened another folder. A name appeared on the screen that made my heart tighten. Daniel L. I jumped to my feet, the metal chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. Howard, what are you doing? I asked, though part of me already knew. He turned to me, his eyes filled with exhaustion and resolve. Margaret, I tried to avoid this for as long as I could, but you need to know. He clicked the mouse. A flood of documents appeared. Bank statements, emails, security camera stills, all bearing my son's name. My throat went dry. No, Daniel wouldn't. Howard raised a hand, signaling me to sit. Look. I looked, and line by line, number by number, it felt like hammer blows crashing into my chest. $372,000. The figure was highlighted in red on a summary sheet. Gambling debt accumulated in less than 2 years. Casinos in Atlantic City, Howard said slowly, and several underground gambling rooms. I shook my head, feeling like I was reading the file of a stranger. Daniel doesn't gamble. He's always hated that stuff. Howard didn't argue. He simply turned to another page. Photos of Daniel leaving a casino, a baseball cap pulled low. Another image showed him sitting in a VIP room, stacks of multicolored chips in front of him. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Why do you have all of this?" "Because I had to know," Howard said, "and because someone wanted me to know." He opened another email. The sender was an unfamiliar address. The recipient, Daniel. "We need someone inside the family, someone with access to the assets. You're a good fit." I let out a hollow laugh. "Family? Is that what they're calling us?" Howard didn't laugh. "They're talking about you and me." I looked at him, then back at the screen. "What about Claire?" I asked, my voice shaking. Howard typed a few keys. Another folder opened, labeled Claire B. "Claire has worked at a bank since she was very young," he said. "At first, just an administrative position. But then transfer records appeared. Small transactions, scattered, hard to detect. But when assembled, they formed a clear money trail. Funds moving in, funds moving out, routed through multiple accounts and shell companies. She helped move the money," Howard said. "Not directly, but enough to stay under the radar. Daniel owed money. Blackridge offered a solution." My stomach twisted. "What solution?" "Money laundering," he replied, "and in return, they wiped out his debt." I stood up and took a few steps around the cramped room, clutching my chest. "No, Daniel couldn't." "Daniel did," Howard said, without anger, without judgment, just the bare truth. "He signed the papers, took the money, and followed instructions." I turned back to him. "Then what about Silver Haven?" Howard opened another folder. This time it contained images of a beautiful, bright building. Green grounds, a small pond, a silver-plated sign, Silver Haven Senior Living. "A luxury care facility," I murmured. "Claire said it was the best." Howard nodded. "On paper." He pulled out a chart, timelines marked in red. "People who go in here," he said, "live an average of no more than 11 months. My eyes widened. "What?" "Heart failure," he continued. "Strokes, kidney failure, natural causes." I trembled. "But they're elderly. That happens." Howard shook his head. "Not at this rate." He opened another statistical table. Cold, emotionless numbers. A comparison between Silver Haven and other facilities in the same region. 3 times higher, he said. And all of these people had one thing in common. "What?" I whispered. "Significant assets," Howard replied. "Homes, retirement funds, real estate." My head felt like it was about to explode. "You're saying?" "Silver Haven is a legal place to end the lives of wealthy seniors," he said, "with paperwork, with signatures, with decisions made in their best interest." I collapsed back into the chair, no longer able to stand. "And Daniel..." Howard looked at me, sadness deeper than ever in his eyes. "Daniel needed money, and they needed control of our assets." "So that's why they said we were incompetent," I whispered, the pieces finally fitting together. "That's why they wanted legal power of attorney," Howard nodded. "Once we enter Silver Haven, the assets transfer legally. No disputes, no investigations." I broke down, tears pouring uncontrollably. "He's my son." Howard came to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I know." I looked up at him. "When did you know?" "A year ago," he answered, when Daniel started asking questions he'd never asked before. I remembered. Recent dinners, Daniel asking about the will, about insurance, about the value of the lake house. I had laughed, thinking it was just the idle concern of an adult child. "I meant to tell you," Howard continued, "but I hoped Daniel would stop." I wiped my tears, my voice breaking. "But he didn't." Howard shook his head. "No. And as the gambling debt grew, As Black Ridge tightened the pressure, he chose the easiest path. I clenched my hands. Killing us. With paperwork. Howard said nothing. The silence answered for him. Above us, footsteps sounded. I heard Daniel's voice drifting down, indistinct but enough to make my heart ache. "Margaret," Howard said softly, "I need you to understand one thing." I turned to him. "We're not just protecting ourselves," he said. "We're standing against a system that has killed a lot of people, legally." I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to hold. "And our son is part of that system." Howard nodded slowly. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, I knew I was no longer the woman I had been a few hours earlier. My last innocence had been stripped away, not by a distant enemy, but by my own blood. "If this is a war," I said, my voice low but steady, "then I want to know where I stand." Howard looked at me, and for the first time in that room, he smiled. Not a smile of relief, but the smile of a man who was finally no longer fighting alone. "You stand with me," he said, and in that moment, between concrete walls and buried secrets, I understood that the most painful thing wasn't betrayal itself, but realizing you must face that truth in order to survive. Howard didn't hesitate another second. He pulled a small black phone from the bottom drawer of the desk, its surface matte, no logo, no touchscreen, like any phone I had ever known. It looked like a device from another world, a world I had just been dragged into without time to adjust. "Satellite phone," Howard said, as if reading my thoughts. "It doesn't rely on local towers. It can't be cut off." I watched him dial a short sequence of numbers, fast, decisive. My heart was pounding so loudly I feared the people upstairs might hear it. The call connected almost immediately. "Lewis?" A woman's voice answered, calm and firm. "Confirm identity." Howard responded with a string of characters I didn't understand. The woman fell silent for 2 seconds, then her tone changed. No longer verification, but confirmation. "Confirmed. Are you safe?" Howard glanced at me. "Not yet," he said, "but we're alive." I heard the sound of typing on the other end. Then her voice came back clearer, more serious. "Our team is en route. Estimated time to reach you, 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Under normal circumstances, that would be just the time it takes for a cup of coffee to go cold. Right now, it felt as long as an entire lifetime. "Silver Haven," Howard continued, "and Dr. Raymond Cole." "We know," the woman replied. "Both have been under surveillance for over 2 years." I held my breath. Howard didn't look surprised, but for me, it was another blow to my understanding. "Daniel and Claire," Howard said slowly. "They locked us in the basement." There was a very brief pause. Then her voice turned icy. "In that case," she said, "they are approaching the threshold of committing federal kidnapping." I closed my eyes. My son. The word kidnapping sounded too distant, too brutal to be attached to the name Daniel, the boy who once sobbed when he broke his arm at 8, who used to call me every night his first week of college because he couldn't sleep. "We need you to remain where you are," the woman continued. "Do not confront them. Do not reveal yourselves." Howard nodded instinctively, even though she couldn't see him. "Understood." The call ended. Howard set the phone down, his hands still steady. I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. "You said federal witness protection?" I asked, my voice so low I could barely hear it myself. Howard exhaled slowly, as if finally allowing himself to relax just a little. 5 years, he said. 5 official years. I turned to him, unable to hide my shock. 5 years, and I never knew. "Because you weren't allowed to," he replied, "and because I didn't want you to." I gave a soft, humorless laugh. You protected the whole world, but thought I couldn't handle the truth. Howard looked at me, his gaze gentle. I thought that if you didn't know, you could live like a normal person a little longer. I was about to respond when a noise above startled me. A door slammed open, rushed footsteps. No more stealth. "Howard," I whispered, "something's wrong." Howard moved quickly to the computer and activated the camera system. The screen split into multiple small windows, each showing a corner of the house I thought I knew down to every creak. The living room, the front door wide open. Daniel stood there. But he wasn't alone. Beside my son were two unfamiliar men. Both wore dark jackets, solid builds, eyes so cold I shivered just looking at them on the screen. "Where's Claire?" I asked, my heart racing. Howard zoomed in on another camera. The back exit. Claire's car was gone. "She left," Howard said, his voice darkening. "She ran." My lungs felt like they'd been emptied. "She left Daniel behind?" "No," Howard replied. "She played her role, sent others." I looked back at the screen. Daniel was speaking to the two men. His face was tense, but not panicked. Not the look of someone being forced. "Our son," I whispered. "Does he know who they are?" Howard was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "Yes." One of the men walked to the basement door. I saw his hand rest on the handle, testing it lightly. The door didn't open. He turned to Daniel and said something. Daniel nodded. My heart slammed painfully against my ribs. "Howard, what are they going to do?" Howard didn't answer right away. He stared at the screen, like someone rereading a script he had predicted but still hoped wouldn't come true. "They want what's down here," he said finally. "The evidence. And if necessary, to eliminate the witnesses." I clenched my hands. "So our son is leading them," Howard said without flinching. A knock echoed from the basement door. Not polite, not asking. A knock meant to announce. "Dad, Mom." Daniel's voice came down through the thick concrete. "Open the door. This has gone too far." I stepped forward instinctively, the reflex of a mother, but Howard stopped me. "Margaret," he said softly. "Don't. I have to talk to him," I whispered. "He's still my son." Howard looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded. "1 minute. Just one." I moved closer to the door, my heart threatening to leap from my chest. "Daniel!" I called, forcing my voice to stay steady. "What are you doing?" There was a pause. Then Daniel answered, his voice deeper, harder. "You wouldn't understand, Mom. Everything is more complicated than you think. It can all stop," I said, tears spilling. "You just need to leave this house. Right now." I heard my son sigh. "I can't." "Because of the money?" I asked. "Or because of them?" Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Because I've gone too far, Mom." I closed my eyes. In that moment, I understood that the person standing upstairs was no longer the little boy I once held in my arms. He was a man who had made a choice, and that choice was pushing all of us toward the edge. Howard pulled me away from the door. On the screen, one of the two men had begun scanning the walls, his gaze probing. "We don't have much time," Howard said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "They know there's something here." I looked at him, then back at the screen, where my son was standing among strangers inside the very house I had once believed was the safest place in the world. The danger was no longer a possibility. It had crossed the threshold. Howard didn't say another word. He simply took my hand and led me away from the desk area, deeper into the back of the hidden room. There, under the dim yellow light, I saw a low steel door almost blending into the concrete wall. "When did you do all this?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "One night at a time," Howard answered shortly. "Over 2 years." He unlocked it. The door made a very soft sound and opened, revealing a narrow passage sloping downward, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through. Inside was pitch dark, the air cold and damp, smelling of earth mixed with metal. "A tunnel," I said, not sure whether I was asking or stating a fact. "It leads to the Miller family's house," Howard said. 3 houses south. They moved away last year." I stood frozen. "You even prepared an escape route?" Howard turned to look at me. His eyes weren't panicked, weren't dramatic. They held only the steadiness of a man who had prepared for this moment for a very long time. "Margaret," he said, "listen to me." He went back to the desk, opened a small compartment inside the safe, and took out a black hard drive, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. "A complete copy," he said, placing it in my hand. "Everything." I gripped it, feeling as though I were holding our entire life, and perhaps the lives of many others. "No," I said immediately, shaking my head hard. "No way. If we go together." Howard looked at me for a long moment. "We can't." "What are you going to do?" I asked, my heart racing. He turned to a control panel mounted on the wall. On it was a red button covered by a clear plastic guard. "Destroy the evidence," he said. "The originals." I stepped back. "What did you say?" "If they get into this room," Howard said slowly, "they can take or alter the data. The external copies won't matter if they can prove the source was compromised." "But you said there was an automatic system." "It still needs time," he cut me off, his voice turning firm for the first time. "And we don't have time." The sounds upstairs grew louder, no longer cautious footsteps, but heavy shoes moving straight down the basement stairs. I heard metal scraping against the wall, low, urgent voices. "Howard," I said, tears spilling over, "you can't stay." He stepped in front of me, placed both hands on my shoulders, and looked straight into my eyes. "Margaret, you have to go." "What about you?" I asked, my voice breaking. He smiled very faintly. "I'll stay here, and I'll make sure they don't get what they want." I shook my head, desperate. "Daniel is our son." Howard closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, his calm was almost unbearable. "And that's exactly why you have to go." The outer basement door burst open. Metal scraped hard against the steps. I spun around in shock. "No time," Howard said. He pushed the hard drive deeper into my hand. "Take this. Go. Now." I didn't know where I found the strength to keep talking. "If you stay, I know," he said, "but I also know what I'm doing." He pulled me into a tight embrace. The familiar scent of his clothes, the familiar rhythm of his heartbeat. Everything burned itself into my memory one last time. "Margaret," he whispered in my ear, "you live. That's what matters most." I had no strength left to argue. The footsteps were very close now. I heard Daniel's voice echoing down, tense and urgent. "I know you're down there, Dad," Daniel shouted. "Don't make this worse." Howard released me and gently pushed me toward the tunnel. "Go," he said. I bent down and crawled into the narrow passage. Cold earth scraped against my hands. I turned my head for one last look. Howard stood upright, his back to the tunnel, facing the room and whatever was about to come. "Howard," I called. He didn't turn around. He only raised his hand in a silent signal. I crawled into the darkness. The tunnel was so tight I had to breathe very slowly. My knees scraped against the dirt, burning with pain. Every movement made a soft rustling sound, and my heart pounded with fear of being discovered. Behind me, voices grew clearer. Strangers' voices, Daniel's voice. "There's something here," a man said. "My father hid it," Daniel replied, his voice tight. "I'm sure of it." I bit my lip to keep from crying out. Every word from my son felt like a knife twisting into my back. I kept crawling through the thick darkness. The tunnel was longer than I'd expected. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Then I heard another sound, far away, very faint, but unmistakable. Sirens. At first, just a single sound, very distant. I thought I was imagining it from the stress. But then it sounded again, and again, more of them, closer. Police sirens. My heart pounded so hard my ears rang. I crawled faster, my hands shaking, not daring to stop. Behind me, the noise suddenly turned chaotic. I heard shouting, running footsteps, metal slamming into walls. FBI sirens blared insistently, cutting through the earth like a signal from another world, the world I was crawling back toward. At the end of the tunnel, a dim light appeared. I crawled a few more steps and emerged through a roughly covered wooden panel into an empty garage. The sudden open space made me dizzy. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. Outside, the sirens were getting closer. I clutched the hard drive to my chest. In my mind, there was only one thought. Not about my own safety, but about the man who had stayed behind the wall, facing everything so that I could live. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what a life and death choice was. A choice with no right or wrong, only a price to be paid. 3 months after that night, I walked into the federal courthouse with ice-cold hands, even though outside it was a beautiful morning with pale sunlight. The gray stone building, the tall steps, and the American flag waving gently in the wind made me feel as though I was entering a place not meant for women nearly 70 years old. But then I thought of Howard, of the look in his eyes that night, and I kept walking. The courtroom was large, the ceiling high, white lights shining down on long wooden benches. I sat in the witness section, my back straight, but my heart pounding so hard I had to place my hands on my thighs to keep them from shaking. In front of me were the judge, the jury, the attorneys with thick folders. Across the room at the defendant's table, I saw Daniel. My son looked thinner. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes avoiding mine. None of the confidence he used to have. In that brief moment, old memories flooded back. His first day of school, his graduation day, the day he brought Claire home, holding my hand and smiling so brightly. I took a deep breath to keep from being pulled under by the past. When I stood to take the oath, my voice filled the terrifyingly quiet room. I heard my own voice, clear and slow, as if someone else were speaking through me. The prosecutor began with basic questions: my name, my age, my relationship to the defendants. Then he looked at me, his expression serious but not cold. "Mrs. Lewis," he said, "please tell the court what happened the night you and your husband were locked in the basement." I closed my eyes for a brief second. When I opened them, I no longer saw the courtroom. I saw the basement door slam shut. I heard the dry click of the lock. I heard Claire's cold voice from above. And I heard Howard whispering in my ear. I told them everything, without embellishment, without avoiding anything. I told them about the morning Daniel and Claire came over with smiles that were far too rehearsed. About Silver Haven, a name that sounded like a dream retirement, but was actually a doorway to death. I spoke about the paperwork, the legal phrases used like scalpels, slowly cutting away our right to decide for ourselves while still appearing lawful. In the courtroom, I saw people lowering their heads to take notes. I saw an older woman in the gallery raise a hand to her mouth, tears silently falling. When I described the hidden room behind the false wall, the years Howard had spent secretly collecting evidence, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. I didn't hide the fact that I had known nothing. I didn't pretend to be stronger than I was. I said plainly that I had trusted trusted my son, trusted the ordinary life I thought I had. Then came Silver Haven. The prosecutor displayed documents the FBI had collected. Charts, statistics, cold numbers filled the large screen behind me. Mortality rates, the average time from admission to death, asset transfers that took place shortly before. Did you know, he asked me, that Silver Haven has had more than 300 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years? I shook my head, my throat tightening. I only found out when it was already too late. A man stood up from the gallery. His hands were shaking, his voice breaking as he asked to speak. The judge allowed it. He introduced himself as the son of a woman who had lived at Silver Haven. "They told me my mother died of heart failure," he said, tears streaming down his face. "But she was healthy when she went in. Just 6 months later, she was gone." The air in the courtroom grew heavy. I realized I wasn't just telling my own story. I was standing among countless others, other lives, other pain buried beneath officially stamped documents. When it was Daniel's turn to be questioned, I didn't look at him. I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't be strong enough to continue. His attorney spoke of financial pressure, of debts, of manipulation by Claire and Blackridge's people. I heard every word, each one like a small but deep cut. "Did you know," the prosecutor asked Daniel, "that locking your parents in the basement and attempting to declare them legally incompetent could have led to their deaths?" Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Just one small nod, but enough to send murmurs through the courtroom. "Then why did you still do it?" came the next question. Daniel lifted his head. For the first time during the entire trial, he looked at me. His eyes were red, exhausted, with nothing left to hide. "Because I thought I had no other choice," he said. I closed my eyes, not because I couldn't bear the truth, but because I realized it had existed for a long time. I just hadn't wanted to face it. Claire was different. She cooperated. She provided names, addresses, methods of transferring money. She spoke smoothly, clearly, like someone who had prepared for this moment long ago. In exchange, her sentence was reduced. I wasn't surprised. Claire always knew how to survive. On the day of sentencing, I sat quietly in the front row. Daniel received a sentence the attorneys called severe but appropriate. I heard the numbers, the legal terms, but they all blurred together. In my mind, there was only the image of a child who once held my hand to cross the street, now standing before the judge. When the trial ended, I walked outside alone. The late afternoon sun warmed the courthouse plaza in a strange, gentle way. I stood there for a long time, breathing, feeling my heartbeat slowly return to normal. I had once believed that being a mother meant carrying every mistake of your child on your own shoulders, that if a child went astray, it must be because you hadn't done enough. But standing in that courtroom, hearing hundreds of stories, both similar and different, I understood something. A mother's love doesn't make her child good or bad. It only gives them a place to begin. The rest, Yisha, is their own choice. I was in pain. There's no other word for it. But I no longer blamed myself. I stood up, I told the truth, and I did what so many people are afraid to do. I looked betrayal straight in the eye, called it by its name, and did not turn away. When I left the courthouse, I knew my life had entered a different chapter. Not a chapter of fear or silence, but a chapter of awakening. And even though the price I had to pay was the pain of being a mother, I accepted it, not as a punishment, but as a truth that had to be faced, so that I could continue living the rest of my life fully and without bowing my head. I thought that when I walked out of that courtroom, everything had finally come to a close, that the truth had been exposed, the villains had been named, and the rest of my life, though scarred, could finally be peaceful. I was wrong. 3 days after the sentencing, as I was sitting alone in the temporary apartment provided by the federal authorities, looking out the window at the last autumn leaves quietly falling onto the sidewalk, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the familiar sound of a neighbor stopping by. It was short, firm, intentional. I knew it wasn't friends coming to check on me, and deep down, I knew that this story was not over yet. 2 FBI agents stood outside the door. They didn't need to introduce themselves. I had grown too familiar with the badges on their jackets, with those eyes that were both polite and alert. "Mrs. Lewis," the woman said, her voice low and measured, "we need to talk to you. Again." I invited them in. The small room suddenly felt tighter, as if the air itself understood that what was about to be said would not be light. The man opened a black briefcase and placed on the table a folder thinner than the ones I had seen before, yet heavy enough to weigh on my heart at first glance. "Victor Harlan," he said, "not the mastermind." I didn't react right away. I just stared at the name that had been repeated throughout the investigation, the name the media had called the brain behind Black Ridge Development. He was only a link, the woman continued, someone in the middle, powerful enough to operate, but not powerful enough to control the entire system. I sat up straighter. Then who was controlling it? They exchanged a very brief look. Then the man said something that sent a chill down my spine. A federal judge. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. I had stood before a judge. I had believed that bench represented the final symbol of justice. And now, that justice had been twisted from within. "He didn't run things directly," the agent continued. "He controlled them with signatures, with rulings, with decisions about which cases moved forward and which ones were shut down." I swallowed hard. "Silverhaven?" "Just one link," the woman confirmed. "A model. There are at least 12 similar facilities in 3 other states." I closed my eyes. The numbers from the courtroom came back to me. Hundreds of deaths. Hundreds of families who had lost loved ones without ever being asked. "Howard," I said softly, almost by reflex. "My husband, did he know?" The man shook his head. "Not in the way you're thinking." He flipped to another page. "We believe Howard was used." I opened my eyes, my heart pounding. "Used how?" "By his integrity," the agent said. "By his desire to bring the truth to light." They explained it to me, piece by piece, each one falling into place with painful, brutal clarity. While Howard believed he was building a case to take down Blackridge and Victor Harlan, someone deeper in the shadows had been quietly steering that effort, removing Harlan, playing the hero, and keeping the real system running in the dark. "Your husband was an engineer," the woman said slowly. "He thought in logic. He believed that if the biggest link fell, everything else would collapse. But it didn't," I whispered. "No," the man replied. "Harlan was expendable." I sat there in silence. In my mind, I saw Howard in that hidden room, his eyes steady, believing he was doing the right thing, believing that once the truth came out, it would correct everything on its own. "So, what do you need me to do?" I asked, even though I had already sensed the answer. The woman placed both hands on the table and leaned toward me. "We need you to continue testifying." I let out a soft laugh, not because it was funny. "I already testified." "Not enough," she said. "What you know, what you've lived through. It can open other doors." I shook my head. "I'm not an investigator. I'm just a woman who lost her husband, lost her son, and nearly lost her life." The man looked at me, his gaze not coercive. "That's exactly why your voice carries weight." I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city kept moving as if nothing had happened. People going to work, shopping, laughing. No one knew that beneath that orderly surface was a network that had taken so many lives. "I don't know if I have the strength," I said, my voice tired. "Every time I tell it, I relive everything." "We understand," the woman said softly, "and we won't force you." I turned back to them. "But if I don't, then those people," she said, "may never be named." In my mind, I saw the man who had stood up in the courtroom, the son who lost his mother at Silver Haven, the older women who had covered their mouths and cried as they listened to me speak. I thought of myself just a few months earlier, naive, believing that family and the law were enough to protect me. "You're saying the truth goes deeper," I said, "and that I've only seen the surface." The man nodded. "That's right." I closed my eyes. In that brief darkness, I heard Howard's voice, not from a specific memory, but from the essence of who he was, his steadiness, his belief that silence was never the answer. When I opened my eyes, I knew I couldn't turn away. "I need time," I said. "Of course," the woman replied, "but you should know. We don't have much." After they left, the room grew quiet again. I sat down, feeling the weight of everything I had just heard pressing on my chest. Victor Harlan was not the mastermind. Silver Haven was just one link. Howard, the man I loved for nearly half my life, had been used as a tool to clear the way for someone else. The truth was not only painful, it was more complex than anything I had ever imagined. I looked at my hands. The hands that had trembled while signing papers, that had clutched the hard drive in the dark tunnel, that had rested on the witness stand in court. I was no longer the woman I used to be. That evening, I took out a stack of blank paper. I began writing down names, faces, stories I had heard in the courtroom. Each line was a reminder that if I stopped, everything could sink back into silence. I was still afraid. I was still hesitant. But the memory of the victims, those who never had a chance to stand up, pushed me forward, and for the first time since everything began, I understood that I was not just a witness to a conspiracy. I had become part of the truth, a truth still waiting to be pulled into the light. It took me nearly a week to make my decision, not because I didn't understand the importance of speaking out, but because I understood the cost all too well. I had seen what happened to those who asked questions. I had lived with a man who carried the truth in silence for more than 2 decades, and I knew that once you stepped into the light, there was no way back. Then, one very early morning, while the city was still wrapped in a thin layer of fog, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The first sunlight of the day fell across the old wooden surface where Howard and I had sat facing each other hundreds of times. I placed my hand on that table, closed my eyes, and in that moment, I no longer hesitated. I called the FBI agent back. "I agree," I said. My voice was so calm that I surprised even myself. "I'll go public with the story." Everything moved very quickly after that. So quickly that it felt as if I were being swept along by a current that had been waiting for a long time. Journalists began reaching out. Interviews were scheduled. The same questions repeated over and over, drilling into details I had tried to forget just to survive. The first time I sat in front of a camera, I trembled. Not because I was afraid of judgment, but because I knew I was opening the door to so many painful memories. Not only mine, but others as well. "I'm not a hero," I said in that first interview. "I'm just a woman who almost lost her right to live, and I don't want that to happen to anyone else." The program aired that evening. I didn't dare watch it. I turned off the television and sat in the quiet living room, listening to the clock tick. But the next morning, my phone began ringing non-stop. The first calls were from strangers. A woman with a trembling voice introduced herself as the daughter of someone who had lived at Silver Haven. An older man called to say his wife had died just 8 months after entering a nursing facility, and he had never understood why all the property paperwork had been handled so quickly. They told their stories. I listened. Some cried, some were angry. Some stayed silent for a long time on the other end of the line, as if for the first time in their lives they no longer felt alone. The media response was stronger than I had imagined. Not just one article or one program, but a wave of independent investigations. Journalists digging into old rulings. Decisions that once seemed harmless were suddenly examined under a different light. The name Silver Haven appeared everywhere. Then other names followed. Premium care facilities with unusually high death rates, hastily signed rulings, files closed without questions, and then the name the FBI had mentioned, the federal judge, began appearing in the headlines. At first, just suspicions, then evidence, accounts and relatives' names, financial ties that could not be explained. The day he was arrested, I was sitting in a small waiting room at a newsroom, preparing for another interview. A young assistant walked in, eyes wide, her voice unable to hide her shock. "They just arrested him," she said, "right in his office." I didn't cheer. I didn't feel victorious. I simply sat down, placed my hand on my chest, and felt a lightness, as if part of an invisible burden had finally been lifted. The network began to collapse in ways I had never thought possible. Not in a single day, not with one decisive blow, but piece by piece, link by link, pulled into the light and forced to face the truth. New investigations were opened. Old rulings were reviewed. Hundreds of families received answers they had waited years for, even though those answers could never bring their loved ones back. During those months, there were times I was exhausted. Nights when I lay staring at the ceiling, wondering whether I had done the right thing, whether reopening all that pain truly brought any good. Whenever that happened, I thought of Howard, not in a sentimental way, but in a very practical one. I thought of his patience, the way he documented every detail, not out of hatred, but because he believed the truth had to be protected. I thought of how he had always stood behind me throughout our marriage, quietly, without show, but unshakably steady. And I understood that in some way he was still standing behind me now. I was no longer just a witness. I began to be invited to hearings on elder rights. I spoke to community groups. I met older people living alone, people who had signed documents without fully understanding the consequences. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," I often said. "I'm here to say that you have the right to ask questions, the right to refuse, the right to live out your life without being treated as an asset that needs to be handled." Gradually, I realized I had become something I never imagined, an advocate. Not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I had gone through my greatest fear and learned what it looked like. I knew how silence could kill, and I knew that a voice, even a trembling one, could still create change. My family is no longer what it once was. That is the truth, and I won't soften it. There are no more noisy dinners, no more weekend calls from my son. There are empty spaces nothing can fill. But I have no regrets, because if I had stayed silent, I would have spent the rest of my life with a question that had no answer. Could I have done something differently? Now, every time I stand in front of a room full of people, every time I see an older woman nod as she listens to me speak, I know I made the right choice. Not the easy path, but the necessary one. And in the quietest moments, when I am alone, I feel it clearly. Howard never left. He is there in every decision I make, in every word I bring into the light. My family has changed. I have changed, but I do not turn back, because this time I choose not to be silent. When everything finally settled, I realized that life had not returned me to the starting point. It had placed me on a different path. Not loud, not glamorous, but steadier than I ever thought I could stand at 69. I began to travel. At first, just short flights, small talks at community centers, local libraries where people still gather to listen to one another's stories. Then, gradually, invitations came from different states. I stood before rooms full of gray hair and seasoned eyes, and I told my story, not to shock, but to illuminate. I spoke about the small signs we often overlook, questions about paperwork that come too early, offers made for your parents' own good that carry an unsettling urgency, gentle smiles hiding impatience. I didn't use harsh words. I didn't need to. The people in front of me understood all too well what it felt like to be dismissed simply because of age. Some evenings, after I finished speaking, an older woman would grip my hand tightly and whisper, "Thank you. I was about to sign papers last week." Sometimes men lingered long after the room had nearly emptied, just to ask one question. Where should I start? I didn't offer formulas. I had no miracles. I simply said, start by asking questions. Read carefully. Call someone outside the family for advice. And most important, trust your own instincts, even when they make you uncomfortable. There were times I was tired, times I wanted to return to a quiet room, close the door, and live the rest of my life in silence. But then I remembered the faces that had listened to me speak. I remembered the stories they carried, stories that had never been told. And I understood that if I stopped, it wouldn't be because I lacked strength. It would be because I was afraid to keep facing the truth. I am no longer a victim. That didn't come from a medal or a title. It came from the moment I stopped asking what I had done wrong and started asking, what can I do next? I am a survivor not because I escaped, but because I stayed with the truth long enough for it to lose its power to hurt me. I learned to love myself in a very different way, not through affirmations in the mirror or luxurious trips, but by allowing myself to rest when I needed to, by saying no without guilt, by understanding that my value is not in what I own or the roles I once played, but in the clarity I have managed to keep until today. Some nights I still think about my son. I remember his laughter as a child, the way he used to hold me tightly whenever he was afraid. I don't deny that longing. I don't push it away. But I also don't let it turn into excuse-making. Love does not mean denying the truth. Being a mother does not mean erasing yourself to preserve a beautiful image of your child at any cost. My life did not end with betrayal. It did not end with loss. Those things are real, and I do not minimize them. But they are not the final period. They are a comma, a necessary pause for me to look back, breathe, and move forward, not as who I was, but as someone who has awakened. Every morning, I stand in front of the mirror and look at the gray-haired woman there with a gentleness I never gave myself before. I don't wish to be younger. I don't need that. I only wish to be clear enough to live the rest of my life without bowing to fear. If there is one thing I want to leave behind, it is this. Age does not make us weak. Silence does. When we speak, even late, we not only protect ourselves, we open a path for others to follow. And if you are reading this, if this story touches you in any way, know that you are not alone. If you'd like, tell me where you are listening from, a small town or a familiar street somewhere. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply say that you are still here. If this story helps you see something more clearly, please like it and subscribe so we can continue together through the stories ahead. I am grateful to you for listening, for staying to the very last lines, and for choosing not to turn away. At 69, I do not have a perfect ending. I have a different beginning, and this time, I walk forward with my eyes open, my heart steady and the truth beside me.